I received an urgent call from my bank manager, David Thompson, while at work as a graphic designer in Denver. He sounded concerned and asked me to come in immediately regarding irregularities in my trust fund account. My heart sank because I hadn't checked the account in months, trusting my parents who have access as co-trustees. I assumed it was just paperwork issues, but David's tone suggested something much more serious. I left work early, driving through downtown traffic with growing dread, completely unaware my world was about to shatter. The fluorescent lights in the bank conference room felt harsh against my skin as I sat across from David Thompson, watching him arrange a stack of papers with the careful precision of someone delivering terrible news. His usually warm demeanor had been replaced by professional concern, the kind that made my stomach clench even before he spoke. "Rosa, I need you to look at these transaction records very carefully," he said, sliding the first page across the polished table. "These are withdrawals from your trust fund account over the past 6 months." I picked up the paper with trembling fingers, scanning the columns of numbers that seemed to blur together. Then the amounts came into focus, and my breath caught in my throat. $45,000 withdrawn on March 15th. $15,000 on March 22nd, $80,000 on April 3rd. The list continued page after page, each entry representing a chunk of my future being carved away. "David, there has to be some mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the sterile room. "These amounts, they're enormous." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "Rosa, your trust fund balance was $180,000 6 months ago. As of this morning, the account contains exactly $47.33. The words hit me like a physical blow. $180,000. Gone. Nearly wiped clean. This was my inheritance from grandmother Isabella Martinez, the woman who had worked 16-hour days for 40 years, building her bakery business from nothing. She had saved every penny, lived in the same modest house for decades, and wore the same Sunday dress to church for 15 years, all so she could leave something meaningful for my future. Who authorized these withdrawals? I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. David consulted his computer screen, his fingers clicking across the keyboard. "All withdrawals were authorized by your co-trustees Frank and Sandra Martinez. Your parents have legal authority to access the account for your welfare and benefit." I stared at the transactions again this time, noting the descriptions. Wedding expenses $45,000, European vacation $15,000, real estate down payment $80,000, vehicle purchase $35,000, monthly allowance $5,000. None of these expenses were mine. I had been planning my own modest wedding to my longtime boyfriend Tom, budgeting carefully to keep costs under $3,000. I hadn't taken a vacation in 2 years, let alone to Europe. I rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that I'd bought used with my own savings. "David, these transactions, they're not for me. They're for my sister Jessica." He nodded grimly. "That's what our investigation suggests. The real estate transaction corresponds to a house purchase in Highlands Ranch under Jessica Martinez Williams. The vehicle purchase matches a BMW registered to the same name. The European vacation charge came from a travel agency that confirmed booking for Jessica Williams and her husband, Marcus." I felt nauseous as the reality sank in. My parents had systematically emptied my inheritance to fund Jessica's lifestyle. The wedding that had cost $45,000 was her elaborate ceremony at the Denver Botanic Gardens, complete with a designer dress, professional photographers, and a reception for 200 guests. I had attended that wedding, bringing a modest gift I could afford on my graphic design salary, never imagining it was being paid for with my own money. The monthly allowances," I said, my voice growing stronger with anger. "Those are still being withdrawn." "Yes, $5,000 is transferred to Jessica Williams every month on the 15th. The automatic withdrawal was set up in March and is scheduled to continue indefinitely. I calculated quickly in my head. $5,000 every month for 6 months meant $30,000 in ongoing payments money that could have covered my rent for an entire year. Meanwhile, I had been working late nights on freelance projects, desperately trying to save enough for a security deposit on a better apartment. David pulled out another folder, this one containing photographs and documentation. Our fraud investigation team gathered this evidence. The BMW was purchased at Stevenson Lexus in Lakewood. The house in Highlands Ranch is a 4-bedroom colonial in the backcountry development, purchase price $325,000. The European vacation included first-class flights to Paris, luxury hotel accommodations, and guided tours through France, Italy, and Spain. Looking at the photos of Jessica posing beside her new car, standing in front of her spacious house, and posting social media pictures from European landmarks, I felt a rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. While she was living like a millionaire on my inheritance, I had been eating ramen noodles and postponing dental visits because I couldn't afford the copay. There's more, David continued, his voice gentle but insistent. The investigation revealed additional purchases, a complete furniture set for the new house costing $12,000, a jewelry collection worth $8,000, and ongoing expenses for a personal trainer, spa treatments, and designer clothing subscriptions. I stared at the evidence spread across the table, feeling like I was viewing artifacts from someone else's life. My grandmother Isabella had envisioned this money providing security, perhaps helping me buy a home, start a business, or continue my education. Instead, it had funded Jessica's fantasy lifestyle while I struggled to make ends meet on my modest salary. "What legal recourse do I have?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. David exchanged glances with a woman I hadn't noticed enter the room. She was tall and professional, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a legal briefcase. "Rosa, this is Patricia Stone from our legal department. She's been reviewing your trust documentation." Patricia sat down and opened her briefcase with efficient movements. "Rosa, I need to explain something crucial about your trust structure. Your grandmother, Isabella, was very specific about the terms of this inheritance. While your parents have co-trustee authority, there are significant restrictions they appear to have violated." She pulled out the original trust documents, pages yellowed with age, but still bearing my grandmother's careful signature. The trust specifies that withdrawals exceeding $5,000 require written consent from the beneficiary. That's you. Additionally, the funds are designated exclusively for your benefit, not for family members or third parties. I felt a spark of hope amid the devastation. So these withdrawals were illegal? Potentially, yes. We need to determine whether you provided written consent for these large transactions. I never consented to anything. I wasn't even told about the withdrawals. Patricia made notes in her legal pad. That's significant. Each withdrawal exceeding $5,000 without your written consent represents a potential breach of fiduciary duty. Given the amounts involved, we're looking at possible criminal violations as well as civil remedies. David leaned back in his chair. "Rosa, I need you to understand something else. Your grandmother, Isabella, was an extraordinarily careful woman. She built multiple safeguards into this trust, some of which we're only now discovering. This situation isn't over." I looked between David and Patricia, sensing there was more they hadn't yet revealed. "What do you mean, safeguards?" "Your grandmother anticipated the possibility of family manipulation. She included provisions in the trust that we're still uncovering. Our investigation into the withdrawal pattern has triggered additional protections she put in place." I felt tears forming in my eyes, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of gratitude toward my grandmother and fury toward my parents. Isabella had known. Somehow she had foreseen this exact scenario and tried to protect me even after her death. "What happens now?" I asked. Patricia gathered her papers. "Now we build a case. I'll need you to provide detailed information about your financial situation, any communications with your parents about the trust, and evidence that you never authorized these withdrawals. David's team will continue investigating the transaction patterns. As I left the bank that afternoon, walking through downtown Denver toward my car, I felt like I was seeing the world with different eyes. The inheritance I had counted on for my future security was gone stolen by the two people I should have been able to trust most. But Grandmother Isabella's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, reminding me that she had always believed I was strong enough to fight for what was rightfully mine. I drove through the winding streets of Littleton with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The transaction records sat in a manila envelope on my passenger seat, the evidence of my family's betrayal rustling with each turn. My parents lived in a modest ranch house on Elm Street, the same house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway and had countless family dinners around the oak table my father had built himself. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning to my childhood home to confront the people who had taught me right from wrong, only to discover they had systematically violated every moral principle they had ever preached to me. I found them exactly where I expected my father Frank, reclined in his worn leather chair, reading the Rocky Mountain news, while my mother Sandra sat on the couch crocheting another Afghan for Jessica's house. The television played a cooking show at low volume, and the smell of Sandra's pot roast filled the air. It was a scene of such domestic normalcy that for a moment I questioned whether the bank meeting had been real. "Rosa, sweetheart," Sandra said without looking up from her needlework, "we weren't expecting you. Did you bring Tom? I made extra food." Frank glanced over his newspaper with the casual interest he might show a neighbor stopping by. "How's work treating you? Still designing those websites for small businesses?" I stood in the doorway of the living room envelope, clutched in my hands, struck by their complete lack of concern or guilt. They showed no signs of stress, no indication that they had done anything wrong. If anything, they seemed more relaxed than usual, probably because Jessica's financial needs were being met so generously. "I need to talk to you both about my trust fund," I said, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. Sandra's crochet needle paused for just a moment before resuming its rhythm. Frank turned a page of his newspaper with deliberate slowness. Neither of them looked at me directly. "What about it, honey?" Sandra's tone carried the same patience she had used when I was 8 years old and complaining about bedtime. "It's empty. Someone has been withdrawing money without my permission." Frank folded his newspaper and set it aside with exaggerated care. "Rosa, sit down. Let's talk about this reasonably." I remained standing. "I went to the bank today. David Thompson showed me 6 months of withdrawal records, $180,000, Frank. My entire inheritance from Grandma Isabella." Sandra finally looked up from her crocheting, her expression shifting to one of mild annoyance, as if I were being unnecessarily dramatic about a minor household expense. "Oh, that. Yes, we've been helping Jessica get established in her new life. Marriage is expensive, you know." The casual admission hit me like a slap. No denial, no excuses, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement that they had stolen my inheritance and considered it completely justified. "Helping Jessica," I repeated slowly, "with my money." Frank stood up from his chair, his movements deliberate and paternal. He was still a big man at 62 with the broad shoulders of someone who had worked construction for 30 years before retiring. "Rosa, let me explain something about family responsibility. Jessica is family. She deserved a proper start in married life." "She deserved," I said, my voice rising, "a proper start with someone else's inheritance." Sandra set down her crocheting with an exasperated sigh. "Don't be selfish, Rosa. Jessica is the first one in our family to marry well. Marcus comes from a good family. They have expectations. We couldn't let her embarrass herself with a cheap wedding." I stared at my mother, searching her face for any sign of shame or regret, finding only mild irritation at my lack of understanding. So you decided to spend my inheritance to meet their social expectations. Frank moved closer, adopting the reasonable tone he had always used when explaining why I couldn't have something I wanted. Rosa, you're the practical one in this family. You've always been good with money, responsible, independent. Jessica needs more support. And you assumed I would just accept this. Sandra picked up her crocheting again, her needles clicking together with sharp precision. Well, yes, you're not the type to cause family drama. You understand that sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the people we love. I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. Not the type to cause drama, always the responsible one. I realized that my parents had spent 28 years categorizing me as the child who would accept whatever they decided, while Jessica had been labeled the one who deserved special treatment and unlimited support. Frank. Sandra continued addressing my father while ignoring me entirely. Show Rosa the pictures from Jessica's honeymoon. The hotel in Paris was magnificent. Frank pulled out his phone with enthusiasm, scrolling through photos that Jessica had sent from Europe. Look at this, Rosa. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, that fancy restaurant where they ate escargot. Jessica said it was the most romantic experience of her life. He held the phone toward me, expecting me to share in their vicarious enjoyment of my stolen inheritance. In the photos, Jessica posed in designer clothes against European landmarks, her smile radiant with the satisfaction of unlimited spending power. Meanwhile, I had been working 60-hour weeks, trying to save enough money for a used car to replace my failing Honda. You're proud of this, I said, the realization dawning on me. You're actually proud that you stole my inheritance to give Jessica a luxury vacation. Oh, stole is a harsh word, Frank replied, his tone remaining infuriatingly calm. We're co-trustees. We have legal authority to make decisions about the money. Sandra nodded in agreement. Besides, it's not like you need the money right now. You have a job, you're supporting yourself. Jessica is starting a family. She has different needs. I looked around the living room where I had spent countless hours as a child, noticing details that suddenly took on new meaning. The expensive new television that had appeared last month, Sandra's fresh manicure, and the designer handbag sitting on the counter, Frank's new golf clubs leaning against the wall. They hadn't just stolen my money for Jessica, they had been treating themselves as well. How much of my inheritance have you spent on yourselves? I asked. Frank and Sandra exchanged a quick glance, the first sign of discomfort I had seen from either of them. The money went to family needs, Sandra said carefully. Jessica's wedding, her house, her future security. And yes, we've covered some expenses related to helping her. I understood the euphemism. They had been skimming money for their own purposes while pretending it was all for Jessica's benefit. I want it back, I said firmly. All of it. Frank laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Rosa, be realistic. The money is spent. Jessica can't return her house or her car. The honeymoon is over. We can't undo what's been done. But we can adjust going forward, Sandra added, as if offering a generous compromise. Maybe we can reduce Jessica's monthly allowance from $5,000 to $3,000. Would that make you feel better? I stared at my mother in disbelief. She was suggesting that continuing to steal from my inheritance just at a slightly reduced rate should satisfy my concerns about being robbed. You're planning to keep taking my money. It's family money, Rosa, Frank said with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. Your grandmother left that money to help the family. We're using it to help the family. Grandma Isabella left that money to me specifically. The trust documents have my name on them, not Jessica's. Sandra waved her hand dismissively. Legal paperwork doesn't change family obligations. You should be happy that your money is helping your sister build a good life. I realized that no amount of reasoning would penetrate their wall of entitlement and self-justification. They had convinced themselves that stealing my inheritance was not only acceptable, but morally required a family sacrifice I should embrace rather than resist. What about my future? I asked. What about my security, my ability to buy a house or start a family? Frank shrugged. You'll figure it out. You always do. You're resourceful. The casual dismissal of my entire future hit me harder than their admission of theft. They weren't just stealing my money, they were stealing my opportunities, my choices, my ability to build the life I wanted, and they expected me to thank them for it. Jessica is coming over for dinner Sunday, Sandra said, returning to her crocheting as if the conversation were concluded. You should join us. She wants to show everyone pictures from her anniversary trip to Napa Valley. Another vacation paid for with my inheritance. Another celebration of their theft that I was expected to attend and applaud. I turned toward the door, clutching the envelope of bank records. I'm going to fight this. I'm going to get my money back. Frank called after me, his voice carrying a note of warning. Don't do something you'll regret, Rosa. Family is more important than money. As I reached my car, I heard Sandra's voice through the open window. She'll calm down. She always does. Rosa doesn't like conflict. Driving away from my childhood home, I realized that my parents' greatest miscalculation wasn't underestimating my intelligence or my ability to discover their theft. Their mistake was assuming that the quiet, compliant daughter they had raised would remain silent when faced with the destruction of her entire future. They had counted on my lifelong pattern of avoiding confrontation, never considering that some betrayals run too deep for peace. I returned to my apartment feeling emotionally drained but determined to understand the full extent of my parents' betrayal. My small one-bedroom place in Capitol Hill felt like a sanctuary after the toxicity of that conversation. I spread the bank documents across my coffee table and began organizing them chronologically, trying to build a complete picture of how systematically my inheritance had been dismantled. As I reviewed the papers more carefully, certain patterns began to emerge that made my stomach clench with dread. The withdrawals weren't random or impulsive. They followed a deliberate progression that suggested long-term planning. March had seen the largest single withdrawal for Jessica's wedding. April brought the house down payment. May covered the BMW purchase. Each month built upon the previous theft, creating a cascade of financial destruction. But something about the most recent entries bothered me. The last several transactions included smaller amounts, $2,000 here, $1,500 there, all marked as family consultation fees or estate planning services. These weren't wedding expenses or house payments. These looked like ongoing operational costs for something larger. I called Tom, my boyfriend of 3 years, needing someone rational to help me process what I was discovering. Rosa, slow down, he said after I had rushed through an explanation of the bank meeting and family confrontation. Are you saying your parents stole your entire inheritance? Almost all of it. But Tom, I think it's worse than that. I think they're planning something else. Oh, what do you mean? I looked at the most recent bank statements again. These small withdrawals over the past month, they're not for Jessica's lifestyle expenses. They're paying consultants, lawyers, financial advisors. Why would they need those services if they were just spending my inheritance? Tom was quiet for a moment. Rosa, you need to check your other accounts. Credit cards, savings, anything they might have access to. The suggestion hit me like ice water. I had been so focused on the trust fund that I hadn't considered my other assets. I immediately logged into my bank's website and began reviewing my personal accounts. What I found made me feel physically sick. My savings account, which had contained $25,000 the previous month, now showed a balance of $812. My checking account had been systematically drained through small daily withdrawals, always just under the amount that would trigger fraud alerts. Someone had accessed my accounts using personal information that only family members would know. But worse than the theft was the evidence of planning I found when I dug deeper into my account activity. Someone had updated my contact information with the bank, changing my phone number and email address to ones I didn't recognize. They had requested copies of my investment account statements, my credit reports, and information about my employee retirement benefits. With growing horror, I called my human resources department, dreading what I might learn. "Hi, Rosa," said Janet from HR. "Actually, I'm glad you called. Your father contacted us yesterday asking about early withdrawal procedures for your 401k. He said you were considering some investment opportunities but needed to access your retirement funds." My blood turned cold. "Janet, I never authorized my father to contact you about my retirement account." "Oh," her voice shifted to concern. "He said he was helping you with financial planning and that you had asked him to research your options. He seemed very knowledgeable about your account details." "What specific information did he request?" "He wanted to know the current balance, vesting schedules, withdrawal penalties, and loan options. He also asked about hardship withdrawals and whether you qualified for any exceptions." I calculated quickly. My 401k contained approximately $40,000 after 3 years of consistent contributions. Combined with my depleted savings account, Frank and Sandra were positioning themselves to steal another $65,000 from me. "Janet, I need you to put an immediate hold on my account. No one except me should have access to any information about my retirement benefits." After hanging up with HR, I called my insurance company, my credit card providers, and my investment broker, learning that Frank had contacted each of them within the past 2 weeks. He had attempted to add himself as a beneficiary on my life insurance policy, requested increases to my credit limits, and inquired about liquidating my small mutual fund investments. The scope of their planning was breathtaking. This wasn't an impulsive decision to help Jessica with wedding expenses. This was a systematic operation to transfer every asset I owned into their control, leaving me financially destroyed while they enriched themselves and their favored daughter. I was examining my credit report when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize holding a manila envelope. "Whoa, Rosa Martinez," when she asked when I opened the door. "Yes." "I'm delivering this from Patricia Stone's law office. Please sign here." The envelope contained documents that made everything clear. Patricia had conducted a preliminary investigation into my trust fund and discovered that Frank and Sandra had been meeting with estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, and even bankruptcy specialists over the past 6 weeks. One document was particularly chilling, a consultation summary from a bankruptcy attorney outlining strategies for protecting assets during insolvency proceedings. The lawyer had advised Frank and Sandra on how to transfer property and resources to Jessica's name before filing for bankruptcy, effectively shielding stolen assets from recovery efforts. Another document revealed that they had researched the legal requirements for having me declared financially incompetent, apparently exploring whether they could gain legal guardianship over my finances by claiming I was unable to manage my own affairs. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of emails between Sandra and a private investigator. She had hired someone to monitor my daily routines, my work schedule, my relationship with Tom, and my social activities. The investigator's reports included detailed observations about my habits, my financial stress, and my tendency to avoid confrontation. One email from Sandra to the investigator read, "Rosa has always been the quiet one who doesn't make waves. We need to understand if that's changing. If she becomes difficult about the family financial arrangements, we need to be prepared with alternatives." The alternatives they were preparing included scenarios for completely destroying my credit, claiming I had become addicted to drugs or gambling, and even forging documents suggesting I had agreed to transfer my assets voluntarily. I sat on my couch staring at this evidence, feeling like I was reading about strangers rather than my own parents. The Frank and Sandra I had grown up with were flawed, certainly, and they had always favored Jessica, but this level of calculated malice was beyond anything I had imagined possible from the people who had raised me, who had taught me to say grace before dinner, and to always tell the truth. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. Mom says you're upset about some family financial stuff. Don't worry, everything will work out. See you Sunday for dinner. Can't wait to show you my new jewelry collection." The casual tone of her message treating the theft of my inheritance as minor financial stuff confirmed that Jessica was fully aware of what our parents were doing. She wasn't an innocent beneficiary of their generosity. She was an active participant in their scheme to destroy my financial future. I called Patricia Stone's emergency number, knowing I needed legal protection immediately. "Rosa, I'm glad you called," she said. "I've been reviewing the documents we discussed, and there are some developments you need to know about. Your parents have accelerated their timeline. Based on the financial records we've obtained, they're planning to complete the asset transfer within the next 2 weeks." What does that mean? It means they intend to take everything you have and then disappear into bankruptcy protection before you can recover anything. Rosa, they're not just stealing from you, they're attempting to commit financial murder. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my childhood bedroom down the hall contained photo albums full of pictures showing me with the two people who were now working systematically to destroy everything I had ever worked for. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable, but the evidence was undeniable. Frank and Sandra Martinez had moved beyond favoritism, beyond unfairness, beyond even theft. They were engaged in a calculated campaign to transfer my entire life's work to Jessica while leaving me with nothing but debt and financial ruin. And they expected me to smile through Sunday dinner while admiring Jessica's new jewelry purchased with the money that should have secured my future. I didn't have to wait until Sunday dinner to confront Jessica. She arrived at my parents' house Saturday afternoon while I was there, collecting evidence from my attorney, her new BMW pulling into the driveway with the confident purr of German engineering paid for with my stolen inheritance. Jessica looked radiant as she stepped out of the car, wearing a designer dress I recognized from a boutique in Cherry Creek that charged more for a single outfit than I spent on clothing in 6 months. Her hair had been professionally styled into elegant waves, and her manicured nails gleamed with polish that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Rosa," she called out with artificial warmth as if our last conversation hadn't ended with me accusing our parents of stealing my trust fund. "I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to show you something amazing." She opened the car door and pulled out a series of shopping bags from Nordstrom Tiffany and several boutiques I couldn't afford to window shop at. The casual display of wealth made my throat tighten with anger, knowing that every purchase represented a piece of my grandmother's legacy being converted into Jessica's personal indulgence. "Jessica, we need to talk," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "Of course, but first look at this." She pulled a diamond bracelet from a Tiffany box, holding it up to catch the afternoon sunlight. "Marcus surprised me with this for our 6-month anniversary. Isn't it gorgeous?" The bracelet sparkled with at least 20 diamonds, each stone larger than any piece of jewelry I had ever owned. The casual way Jessica displayed it as if expensive gifts were simply her natural due made me realize how completely our parents' favoritism had warped her sense of entitlement. "How much did that cost?" I asked. "Oh, I don't ask about prices," Jessica said with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. "Marcus handles all the financial details. I just pick out what I like. And what you like is very expensive." She looked at me with confusion, as if my comment made no sense. "Rosa, what's wrong with you lately? Mom said you were upset about some money issues, but you're acting really strange." I followed her into the house where Frank and Sandra were waiting with the eager expressions of grandparents about to be shown pictures of grandchildren. They clearly expected me to participate in another celebration of Jessica's good fortune funded by my destroyed inheritance. "Jessica," I said, positioning myself between her and our parents, "I know about the trust fund. I know that Mom and Dad emptied my inheritance to pay for your wedding. Your house, your car, and your lifestyle." Her expression shifted from confusion to annoyance, like someone being interrupted during a pleasant daydream. Rosa, that's ridiculous. The trust fund money went to family needs. My trust fund went to your personal expenses. Jessica set down her shopping bags and crossed her arms, her posture becoming defensive. Even if that's true, so what, you weren't using the money anyway? The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. No denial, no shock, no guilt. Just irritation that I was questioning her right to spend my inheritance. I wasn't using it because I was saving it for my future. Your future. Jessica's voice rose with indignation. Rosa, you have a job. You can save your own money for your future. I was getting married. I needed help starting my new life properly. I stared at my sister, searching her face for any sign of shame or recognition that she had participated in theft. Instead, I saw only the entitled frustration of someone whose access to unearned luxury was being questioned. Jessica, that money was specifically left to me by Grandma Isabella. It wasn't family money, it was my inheritance. Grandma Isabella loved me too, Jessica snapped. She would have wanted me to be happy. She would have wanted me to have a beautiful wedding and a nice house. Sandra moved closer to Jessica, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. Rosa, you're upsetting your sister over something that's already done. Jessica has worked hard to build a good marriage and establish herself in the community. Worked hard, I repeated. What work has Jessica done? What has she ever earned? Frank stood up from his chair with the deliberate movement of someone preparing to end a discussion. Rosa, that's enough. Jessica contributes to this family in ways you don't appreciate. She represents us well in the community. She married into a good family. She reflects positively on all of us. I realized that in Frank and Sandra's minds, Jessica's primary value lay in her ability to enhance their social status. Her beauty, her charm, her marriage to a banker from an established family, these qualities made her worth investing in. Meanwhile, my quiet competence, my steady work ethic, my financial responsibility, these traits made me useful, but not valuable enough to deserve protection or support. You know what, Rosa? Jessica said, her voice taking on the sharp edge it carried whenever she felt criticized. I'm tired of your jealousy. I've always known you resented me for being more successful. More successful. I couldn't hide my amazement. Jessica, you've never held a job for more than 6 months. You've never paid your own rent. You've never been financially independent for a single day of your adult life. I've been successful at the things that matter, she replied. I'm married to a wonderful man. I have a beautiful home. I'm part of the community social circles. I contribute to charity events and cultural activities. All funded by other people's money. First Mom and Dad's, now mine. Jessica's eyes flashed with anger. Your money, Rosa. You're so selfish. You've always been selfish. Do you know how hard it was growing up with a sister who never wanted to share anything? The accusation was so distorted from reality that I almost laughed. Throughout our childhood, I had shared everything with Jessica because our parents had taught me that being the older sister meant being generous and accommodating. I had given her my toys, my clothes, my books, even my friends when she decided she wanted to spend time with them. I shared everything with you growing up, Jessica. I'm not sharing my inheritance because it's not yours to take. See, that's exactly what I mean. You get this money from Grandma Isabella, and immediately you become possessive and greedy. You don't think about family. You don't think about what other people need. You just want to hoard it for yourself. Frank nodded in agreement. Rosa, your attitude toward money has always been problematic. You save excessively, you deprive yourself unnecessarily, and you don't understand how money should be used to help family members. I felt like I was listening to conversations in a foreign language. My parents and Jessica had created an alternate reality where theft was generosity, where taking someone's inheritance was helping family, where my attempts to protect my financial future constituted greed. I deprive myself, I said slowly, because I'm trying to save money for my own future. I budget carefully because I want to be able to afford a house, a wedding, maybe children someday. You can still afford those things, Sandra said dismissively. You just need to work harder and save more. Jessica has different challenges. She needs to maintain a certain lifestyle to keep her marriage strong and her social position secure. She needs my inheritance to maintain her lifestyle. Rosa, you're being deliberately obtuse, Jessica said. The money is helping both of us. My success reflects well on the whole family. When I'm established in the community, it benefits everyone. I realized that Jessica genuinely believed she deserved my inheritance more than I did. In her mind, her marriage, her social aspirations, and her desire for luxury created a moral claim that superseded legal ownership or grandmother Isabella's intentions. What about my dreams, Jessica? What about my plans? She shrugged, the gesture casual and dismissive. You'll figure something out. You always do. You're resourceful and practical. I need more support because my life is more complicated. Your life is more expensive. That doesn't make it more important. It makes it more valuable to the family, Frank interjected. Rosa Jessica's marriage connects us to influential people in the community. Her social activities create opportunities for all of us. Your job is fine, but it doesn't advance the family's position. I understood then that my parents viewed Jessica and me as investments with different potential returns. Jessica's beauty and social ambitions made her worth financing because she could elevate the family's status. My steady reliability made me useful for supporting others, but not worth protecting or nurturing. I'm going to get my money back, I said, looking directly at Jessica. All of it. She laughed, the sound brittle and dismissive. Rosa, the money is spent. I can't return my house or my car or my wedding. Even if you could prove some legal technicality, there's nothing left to recover. We'll see about that. Jessica picked up her shopping bags and headed toward the door, pausing to deliver one final blow. Rosa, you need to think carefully about what you're doing. If you make trouble for Marcus and me, if you create scandal or legal problems, you'll be cut off from this family permanently. Is money really more important to you than your relationship with the people who love you? As I watched Jessica drive away in her BMW, I realized she had just threatened to exile me from my own family if I tried to recover my stolen inheritance. In her mind, my compliance with their theft was the price of maintaining family relationships. But looking at the evidence spread across my coffee table that evening, I understood that these weren't relationships worth maintaining. People who love you don't systematically destroy your financial future. People who care about you don't steal your inheritance and then threaten to abandon you when you object to the theft. Jessica, Frank, and Sandra had shown me exactly how much they valued my presence in their lives, precisely as much as my bank accounts could provide for Jessica's comfort and their own enhanced social status. It was time to see how much they valued those relationships when the money flow was reversed. Monday morning found me sitting in Patricia Stone's law office on 17th Street in downtown Denver, surrounded by mahogany bookshelves filled with legal volumes and framed diplomas that spoke to decades of experience in family law and estate litigation. Patricia was a sharp woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing as she reviewed the documents I had brought. Rosa, I need you to understand something crucial before we proceed, Patricia said, setting aside the bank records and reaching for a thick file marked with my grandmother's name. Your grandmother Isabella was far more sophisticated about family dynamics than your parents realized. She opened the file to reveal the original trust documents pages of legal text that I had never read carefully when I was grieving Isabella's death 3 years ago. Patricia pointed to specific clauses highlighted in yellow marker. Look at this section carefully. Your grandmother included very specific language about large withdrawals. Any single transaction exceeding $5,000 requires written consent from the beneficiary, which is you, not verbal consent, not implied consent, but actual written documentation signed by you and witnessed by a notary public. I leaned forward to read the dense legal language. I never signed anything. I wasn't even told about most of these withdrawals until I went to the bank. That's what makes this particularly serious. Each withdrawal exceeding $5,000 without your written consent represents a separate violation of fiduciary duty. Looking at your bank records, I count 14 separate violations, each one a potential felony depending on the amounts involved. Patricia pulled out a calculator and began adding figures. The wedding expenses, $45,000. That's 9 separate violations right there, since they should have obtained your consent for each vendor payment over $5,000. The house down payment, $80,000. That's another major violation. The car purchase, $35,000. The vacation expenses, $15,000. My head spun as I watched the legal violations multiply. Each financial blow to my inheritance also represented a separate crime that my parents had committed with casual indifference to the law. But there's more. Patricia continued, turning to another section of the trust documents. Your grandmother also included what's called a protective beneficiary clause. She was very explicit that the funds were designated exclusively for your benefit, not for family members or third parties. She read directly from Isabella's careful handwriting. This trust is established specifically for Rosa Elena Martinez, recognizing her responsible character and her dedication during my final illness. Under no circumstances should these funds be used to benefit other family members, regardless of their perceived needs or social expectations. The words hit me like a physical embrace from my deceased grandmother. She had seen the family dynamics that I was only now beginning to understand. She had witnessed Frank and Sandra's favoritism toward Jessica and had tried to protect me even after her death. Rosa, your grandmother was anticipating exactly what happened. Look at this section about co-trustees. Patricia pointed to another highlighted clause. She granted your parents co-trustee status for emergency access, only specifically defining emergencies as situations involving your health, safety, or educational needs. Funding a sibling's lifestyle doesn't qualify. I felt tears forming in my eyes, not from sadness, but from profound gratitude toward a woman who had understood me better than my own parents. She knew this might happen. She more than knew it might happen. She took specific legal steps to prevent it. Patricia reached for another file, this one containing correspondence between Isabella and various attorneys. Your grandmother consulted with 3 different law firms before finalizing this trust. She researched family manipulation cases, reviewed protection strategies, and built multiple safeguards into the legal structure. Patricia spread out letters written in Isabella's careful script, addressed to attorneys and financial advisors. One letter made my breath catch. I am particularly concerned about Frank and Sandra's tendency to favor my younger granddaughter Jessica over Rosa. While I love both girls, Rosa has demonstrated responsibility and loyalty that I fear the others will take advantage of. I need legal protections that will preserve Rosa's inheritance, even if family members attempt to manipulate the situation. Another letter was even more specific. Jessica is a charming girl, but she has expensive tastes and little understanding of money's value. Frank and Sandra indulge her consistently while expecting Rosa to be self-sufficient. I worry they will see Rosa's inheritance as a resource to fund Jessica's lifestyle rather than Rosa's security. Your grandmother documented her concerns extensively, Patricia explained. These letters create a clear legal record of her intentions and her awareness of potential family manipulation. In court, this evidence will be devastating to your parents' claims that they were acting in your best interest. Patricia opened yet another file, this one containing financial records that made my stomach clench. Rosa, I need to show you something else we discovered during our preliminary investigation. Your parents' violations of fiduciary duty extend beyond just spending your money inappropriately. She laid out bank records showing patterns of small withdrawals, each just under the threshold that would trigger automatic fraud alerts. They've been systematically testing your account security, gradually increasing withdrawal amounts to see what the bank's systems would allow. This suggests premeditation and planning, not impulsive family assistance. The evidence painted a picture of calculated theft that went far beyond helping Jessica with wedding expenses. My parents had been running experiments on my account, learning the system's weaknesses and exploiting them methodically. There's also this, Patricia said, producing copies of correspondence between Frank and various financial institutions. Your father has been attempting to gain power of attorney over your other accounts. He contacted your bank, your investment company, and your employer's benefits administrator, claiming you had asked him to handle your financial affairs. I felt nauseous reading Frank's forged letters claiming that I was overwhelmed by financial decisions and needed family assistance managing my accounts. He had researched the legal requirements for financial guardianship and had been building a paper trail suggesting I was incompetent to handle my own money. Patricia, they were planning to take control of everything. That's exactly what they were planning. And Rosa, based on the timeline of these documents, they were planning to complete the asset transfer within the next few weeks. If you hadn't discovered the trust fund theft when you did, you would have lost everything. Patricia gathered the documents and fixed me with a serious look. Rosa, I need you to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. This isn't a family dispute about money. This is systematic financial abuse with clear criminal implications. Your parents violated multiple laws, breached their fiduciary duties, and attempted to defraud financial institutions. She opened her laptop and began typing notes. Based on the evidence, we can pursue both civil and criminal remedies. Civil court will focus on recovering your stolen funds, plus damages and legal fees. Criminal charges could result in significant prison time for your parents. What about Jessica? She clearly knew what was happening. Jessica's legal exposure depends on her level of active participation. If she simply benefited from the stolen funds, that's different from actively participating in the theft. But if she helped plan or execute the financial fraud, she could face charges as an accessory. I thought about Jessica's casual admission that she knew about using my money, her complete lack of guilt, and her threat to cut me from the family if I pursued legal action. She knew exactly what they were doing. She encouraged it. Patricia made more notes. We'll investigate Jessica's involvement thoroughly. The important thing now is protecting your remaining assets and beginning the recovery process. She handed me a thick packet of legal documents. Rosa, I'm filing for immediate injunctive relief to freeze all accounts connected to your parents and Jessica. I'm also requesting a full forensic audit of the trust fund transactions and an emergency hearing to remove your parents as co-trustees. As I left Patricia's office that afternoon, I felt a complex mixture of anger and relief. Anger at the systematic nature of my parents' betrayal, but relief that grandmother Isabella had anticipated this situation and built legal protections into the trust structure. Walking through downtown Denver toward my car, I realized that this case would destroy any remaining pretense of family harmony. Frank, Sandra, and Jessica would soon face serious legal consequences for their theft, and they would blame me for their predicament rather than accepting responsibility for their crimes. But as I clutched the legal documents that would begin the process of recovering my inheritance, I felt grandmother Isabella's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. She had given me more than money. She had given me the legal tools to fight back against the people who had stolen my future. 3 days after filing the initial legal paperwork, I received an unexpected call from David Thompson at the bank. His voice carried an excitement that I hadn't heard during our previous conversations about the devastating theft of my inheritance. Rosa, I need you to come in immediately. There's been a significant development in your case that changes everything. I rushed to the bank during my lunch break, finding David waiting with Margaret Channer, a woman I hadn't met before. She was introduced as the senior investigator for the bank's fraud prevention division, and her presence suggested that my case had escalated beyond simple trust fund mismanagement. Rosa, please sit down, David said, his demeanor more animated than I had ever seen. What I'm about to tell you will shock you, but in the best possible way. Margaret opened a thick file marked Confidential Investigation and began spreading documents across the conference table. Rosa, our fraud detection algorithms flagged the withdrawal pattern from your trust fund 3 months ago. The systematic depletion triggered an automatic review that uncovered something extraordinary. She pulled out a document I had never seen before, bearing my grandmother's signature and dated just 2 months before her death. Your grandmother, Isabella, established a secondary monitoring system with our wealth management division. She anticipated the possibility of trust fund manipulation and created what we call a dead man's switch protection. David leaned forward with obvious excitement. Isabella deposited $75,000 into a completely separate account, accessible only to you and only when specific conditions were met. The conditions were met when the systematic withdrawal pattern triggered our fraud investigation. I stared at the documents, struggling to comprehend what they were telling me. Grandma Isabella created a backup account. Mom, more than that, Margaret continued. She established an entire secondary trust structure that your parents knew nothing about. The backup account has been accumulating interest for 3 years, bringing the total to $92,000. She showed me bank statements for an account I had never known existed, funds that had been growing steadily while my parents systematically looted my primary inheritance. The monthly interest payments alone exceeded what I typically managed to save from my salary. But the backup account is just the beginning, David said, producing another file. Isabella's protective measures included specific instructions for what the bank should do if the primary trust was compromised. Margaret read from Isabella's handwritten instructions. If my primary trust for Rosa is systematically depleted in a manner inconsistent with her welfare and benefit, this institution is authorized to freeze all related accounts, initiate legal proceedings against the violating trustees, and activate my secondary protection measures. Secondary protection measures, I repeated. Isabella established relationships with 3 different law firms, a private investigator, and a forensic accountant. Margaret explained. She prepaid for their services and left detailed instructions about investigating trust fund abuse. Rosa, your grandmother, created an entire legal army that automatically activated when your parents started stealing. David pulled out correspondence between Isabella and various professional service providers, all dated in the months before her death. She had been methodically preparing for exactly this scenario, consulting experts about family manipulation and financial abuse. Your grandmother was remarkably thorough, Margaret said. She researched similar cases, studied legal precedents, and designed protections specifically tailored to your family's dynamics. One letter from Isabella to her attorney made me gasp. I have observed Frank and Sandra's financial pressures and their tendency to treat Jessica as more deserving of support than Rosa. I fear they will view Rosa's inheritance as a solution to their favorite daughter's expensive lifestyle. Rosa is too loyal and conflict-averse to protect herself adequately, so I must build protection she cannot dismantle through misplaced family loyalty. My grandmother had seen everything. She had watched Frank and Sandra favor Jessica throughout our childhood, had witnessed their financial struggles and their materialistic values, and had predicted with uncanny accuracy exactly how they would try to manipulate my inheritance. There's more, David said, his voice growing even more excited. The secondary trust includes provisions for punitive damages against trustees who violate their fiduciary duties. Isabella's legal team has been building a case against your parents for the past 3 months. Margaret showed me a timeline that made my head spin. The bank's fraud investigation had triggered automatic notifications to Isabella's prepaid legal team, who had been gathering evidence and building a case without my knowledge. Private investigators had been documenting my parents' spending patterns, their financial communications, and their attempts to access my other accounts. Well, Rosa, your grandmother didn't just give you money. She gave you a complete legal protection system that activated automatically when you needed it most. David opened another file containing photographs and documentation that stunned me. Isabella's investigators have been tracking every purchase made with your stolen inheritance. The BMW, the house, the vacation, expenses, the designer clothing, even Jessica's jewelry collection, they've documented everything. The photographs showed Jessica wearing dresses and jewelry purchased with my money, Frank driving a new truck, Sandra enjoying spa treatments and expensive dinners. Every luxury they had enjoyed while systematically destroying my financial security had been photographed and documented by Isabella's team. But the most important discovery, Margaret said, lowering her voice dramatically, is that your parents violated specific federal laws by accessing your trust fund without proper authorization. Isabella's legal team has been working with federal prosecutors for the past month. I felt dizzy as the implications sank in. Federal prosecutors, your parents committed wire fraud when they transferred money electronically without authorization. They committed mail fraud when they used forged documents to access your accounts. They violated federal elder abuse statutes by manipulating the trust of a deceased person. Rosa, this is now a federal criminal case. David handed me a letter from Isabella that had been sealed and marked to be opened only when the secondary protections were activated. With trembling hands, I broke the wax seal and read my grandmother's final message. My dearest Rosa, if you are reading this letter, it means Frank and Sandra have done exactly what I feared they would do. They have stolen your inheritance to fund Jessica's lifestyle, believing you are too kind and too loyal to fight back effectively. I am writing this to tell you that fighting back is not only acceptable, it is necessary. Family love does not require accepting financial abuse. True family loyalty means protecting each other's welfare and future security, not enabling theft and manipulation. I have given you the legal tools to recover what is rightfully yours and to hold your parents accountable for their betrayal. Use these tools without guilt or hesitation. You deserve security, respect, and a future built on your own merits, not diminished by others' greed. I believe in your strength and your integrity. Fight for yourself with the same dedication you showed when caring for me during my final illness. With all my love and confidence in your future success, Grandmother Isabella. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face as I realized that Isabella had anticipated not only the theft, but also my emotional struggle with confronting my own family. She had known I would feel guilty about pursuing legal action, and she had given me permission to protect myself. Rosa, Margaret said gently, your grandmother's protections include one more element that will shock your parents completely. She produced a final document that made my breath catch. Isabella purchased a life insurance policy naming you as the beneficiary, but with a very unusual clause. If the primary trust was systematically depleted through family manipulation, the insurance payout would double, bringing the total benefit to $640,000. The room seemed to spin as I processed this information. Not only had Isabella protected my original inheritance through legal safeguards and backup accounts, but she had also ensured that her death would provide me with even greater financial security if my family betrayed my trust. Your parents think they've stolen your entire inheritance and left you helpless, David said with a smile. They have no idea that their theft has actually triggered protections that will make you more financially secure than you ever imagined. As I left the bank that afternoon, clutching copies of documents that revealed the full scope of Isabella's love and foresight, I realized that my grandmother had given me something more valuable than money. She had given me proof that I was worthy of protection care and unconditional support. Frank, Sandra, and Jessica had assumed they could steal my inheritance because they believed I was powerless to stop them. They had counted on my loyalty, my conflict avoidance, and my family obligations to keep me silent while they destroyed my financial future. They had forgotten that grandmother Isabella had loved me enough to anticipate their betrayal and sophisticated enough to build legal protections they never imagined possible. 2 weeks after discovering Isabella's hidden safeguards, I received a call that transformed my understanding of my parents' criminal behavior from theft to something far more sinister and extensive. Agent Robert Coleman from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division contacted me at work requesting an immediate meeting about what he described as the expansion of your case into a federal investigation. I met Agent Coleman at the federal building downtown, passing through metal detectors and security checkpoints that made the seriousness of the situation impossible to ignore. Coleman was a tall, methodical man in his 40s who spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent years building complex financial crime cases. Ms. Martinez, what began as an investigation into your trust fund theft has uncovered something much larger, he said, opening a file thick enough to serve as a phone book. Your parents have been operating a systematic elder financial abuse scheme for over 15 years. The words hit me like ice water. What do you mean, systematic scheme? Agent Coleman spread photographs across the table showing elderly faces I recognized from my childhood. Frank and Sandra Martinez have been targeting vulnerable elderly relatives and community members, gaining their trust, obtaining financial power of attorney, and then systematically draining their accounts. He pointed to the first photograph, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This is your grandfather's brother, Robert Martinez. Frank gained power of attorney when Robert developed early-stage dementia. Over 18 months, Frank transferred $230,000 from Robert's accounts to various family members, primarily Jessica. My throat tightened as I recognized Uncle Robert, who had always been kind to me during family gatherings. Uncle Robert thinks his money went to medical expenses and nursing home care. In reality, most of it funded Jessica's wedding and honeymoon. Agent Coleman continued through the photographs like a detective presenting evidence of multiple murders. Sandra's Aunt Margaret, $147,000 stolen over 2 years. Frank's elderly neighbor, Harold Patterson, $89,000, taken after Frank offered to help manage his finances following his wife's death. Mrs. Dorothy Chen from your parents' church congregation, $112,000 stolen after Sandra befriended her and convinced her to sign financial documents. Each photograph represented a vulnerable elderly person who had trusted my parents and been systematically robbed. The scope of their operation was breathtaking and horrifying. Agent Coleman, how many people are we talking about? We've identified 23 victims so far, with total theft exceeding $1.8 million. Your trust fund case was just the beginning. He showed me bank records documenting transfers from numerous elderly victims' accounts, all flowing toward the same destinations. Jessica's various expenses, my parents' luxury purchases, and increasingly elaborate schemes to hide the stolen money. The most disturbing aspect, Agent Coleman continued, is how they selected and groomed their victims. Frank and Sandra specifically targeted elderly people who were isolated, recently widowed, or showing early signs of cognitive decline. He produced surveillance photographs showing Sandra visiting elderly church members, bringing them meals and offering friendship. Frank appeared in pictures helping elderly neighbors with yard work and home maintenance. What looked like Christian charity was actually reconnaissance for financial predators. They would spend months building relationships before gradually introducing financial topics. Sandra would express concern about the elderly person's ability to manage complex financial decisions. Frank would offer to help organize their paperwork or accompany them to bank appointments. Agent Coleman showed me forged documents bearing elderly signatures that had clearly been practiced and perfected. Once they gained trust, they would obtain power of attorney documents, often claiming the paperwork was for emergency situations or estate planning. The methodical nature of their operation made me feel sick. These weren't impulsive thefts driven by financial desperation. This was a carefully planned criminal enterprise that had been destroying elderly lives for over a decade. What role did Jessica play in all this, I asked? Agent Coleman opened another section of the file revealing Jessica's much deeper involvement than I had imagined. Jessica served as what we call the social validator. Her youth beauty and charm made elderly victims more comfortable about family financial arrangements. Photographs showed Jessica visiting elderly victims, always dressed attractively and carrying small gifts. She would accompany Frank and Sandra to visits, playing the role of the grateful granddaughter or family friend. Her presence made the victims feel good about helping such a lovely young woman get started in life. The investigation had uncovered recorded phone calls where Jessica spoke to elderly victims, thanking them for their generosity and describing how their help was allowing her to build a stable marriage and secure a future. Jessica wasn't a passive beneficiary, Agent Coleman explained. She actively participated in the emotional manipulation of victims. She knew exactly where the money was coming from and helped maintain the fiction that elderly victims were making voluntary gifts to help family. He played an audio recording that made my blood run cold. Jessica's voice was sweet and grateful as she spoke to one of their victims. "Mrs. Patterson, I can't thank you enough for helping Marcus and me buy our first house. Knowing that someone as wise and caring as you believes in our future means everything to us. I promise we'll make you proud." Mrs. Patterson's elderly voice responded with obvious pleasure. "Oh dear, I'm so happy to help. You remind me of my own granddaughter. Young couples need support to get started properly." Mrs. Patterson had no granddaughter, Agent Coleman said grimly. She was a lonely widow who thought she was helping a young woman she cared about. Instead, Jessica was helping steal her life savings. The investigation had uncovered dozens of similar recordings showing Jessica's systematic manipulation of elderly victims who genuinely cared about her welfare. She had exploited their loneliness, their generosity, and their desire to help younger generations. Agent Coleman, how did they hide this operation for so long? Sophisticated money laundering. Frank and Sandra created multiple business entities, shell companies, and complex transfer schemes to disguise the stolen funds. They also spread the theft across many victims and many years, taking smaller amounts that were less likely to trigger investigations. He showed me business registration documents for companies with names like Family Financial Consulting and Elder Care Support Services. Frank and Sandra had created legitimate-looking businesses to provide cover for their theft and to generate fake invoices justifying large transfers. But their biggest mistake was getting greedy with your trust fund. The large, rapid withdrawals from a single account triggered our automated fraud detection systems. Once we started investigating your case, the pattern of elderly victim targeting became obvious. Agent Coleman explained that federal investigators had been working for 3 months to document the full scope of Frank and Sandra's operation. They had interviewed victims, traced financial transfers, and gathered evidence of systematic elder abuse across multiple states. Your parents moved some of their operations to different states to avoid detection. They targeted elderly relatives in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, always using the same methods: building trust, gaining financial access, and slowly draining accounts. The multi-state nature of their crimes elevated the charges to federal level with potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in prison. Jessica faced similar charges as an active participant in the conspiracy. Ms. Martinez, your courage in pursuing your trust fund case has exposed a criminal operation that has destroyed dozens of elderly lives. Without your legal action, Frank and Sandra would still be finding new victims. As Agent Coleman walked me through the evidence that would be presented in federal court, I realized that my parents weren't just thieves who had stolen my inheritance. They were career criminals who had built a lifestyle of luxury by systematically destroying the financial security of vulnerable elderly people. Jessica wasn't a spoiled daughter who had accepted stolen gifts. She was an active criminal who had looked elderly victims in the eye, expressed gratitude for their generosity, and knowingly participated in schemes that left them financially devastated in their final years. The scope of their operation made my stolen trust fund seem almost small in comparison to the massive suffering they had caused across multiple states and dozens of families. 1 month into the federal investigation, Patricia Stone called me with news that would fundamentally change my understanding of grandmother Isabella's foresight and the extent of her protective measures. Rosa, you need to come to my office immediately. We've discovered that your grandmother's safeguards go far beyond what we initially found. There's an entirely separate legal structure that we're just now uncovering. I arrived at Patricia's office to find her conference table covered with documents I had never seen before, including property deeds, business records, and correspondence with law firms in 3 different states. She looked both amazed and slightly overwhelmed by the scope of what she had discovered. Oh, Rosa, your grandmother didn't just create backup financial protection. She established a completely separate, irrevocable trust that makes you the sole beneficiary of assets your family never knew existed. Patricia opened a legal folder marked Isabella Martinez Secondary Estate Trust and began explaining documentation that made my head spin with its complexity and thoroughness. 3 months before her death, Isabella transferred her house, her business property, her stock portfolio, and the additional cash savings into a second trust structure managed by a different bank and administered by a law firm in Colorado Springs. This trust was designed to be completely invisible to your parents and to activate only when specific conditions were met. She showed me property records indicating that Isabella's house, which I had assumed had been sold after her death, was actually still owned by the secondary trust and had been generating rental income for 3 years. The house has been professionally managed by a property management company Isabella selected. It's currently rented to a family for $1,800 per month, and all rental income has been accumulating in your trust account. I stared at the rental income statements showing over $60,000 in accumulated payments, plus property appreciation that had increased the house's value from $120,000 to $180,000. But the house is just the beginning. Patricia continued opening another file. Isabella's bakery property downtown has also been generating income. She structured a long-term lease with the current business owner, and those payments have been accumulating as well. The bakery property, which Isabella had operated for 40 years, was now worth approximately $150,000 in real estate value. The lease payments had generated another $47,000 in accumulated income. Patricia, how much money are we talking about? She consulted a financial summary prepared by the trust's accounting firm. The secondary trust currently contains $320,000 in cash and property values, plus accumulated income that brings the total to approximately $397,000. The numbers were staggering. While my parents had been systematically stealing my primary inheritance, a much larger inheritance had been growing steadily under professional management, completely hidden from their knowledge or access. Your grandmother's letters to the secondary trust administrators reveal the sophistication of her planning. Patricia said, reading from Isabella's handwritten instructions. She wrote, I have observed Frank and Sandra's manipulation of family financial decisions and their willingness to prioritize Jessica's wants over Rosa's needs. I am creating this secondary protection specifically to ensure Rosa's financial independence regardless of family interference. Another letter was even more detailed. If Frank and Sandra attempt to steal Rosa's primary inheritance, as I suspect they will, she must have resources they cannot access or manipulate. This secondary trust will give Rosa complete financial independence and the ability to pursue legal remedies without fear of economic retaliation from family members. Patricia showed me investment records indicating that Isabella had been quietly moving assets into the secondary trust for over a year before her death. She was systematically protecting your inheritance while maintaining the appearance of normal financial arrangements. The secondary trust included provisions that demonstrated Isabella's deep understanding of family manipulation dynamics. The trust documents specified that no family member other than Rosa could have any knowledge of its existence, let alone access to its assets. Rosa, the most remarkable aspect of this secondary trust is how it was structured to activate. Isabella created what lawyers call a dead man's switch that would reveal the trust's existence only when her primary trust was systematically threatened. Patricia explained that the secondary trust had been monitoring news of legal proceedings related to the primary trust. When I filed lawsuits against Frank and Sandra, the secondary trust's administrators were automatically notified and began the process of transferring assets to my direct control. Your grandmother anticipated that you would need financial resources to fight your parents' theft. She made sure you would have substantial assets available for legal fees, living expenses, and complete independence from family financial pressure. The trust documents included a personal letter from Isabella that brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Rosa, if you are learning about this secondary trust, it means my fears about Frank and Sandra were justified. They have stolen your primary inheritance, believing they could manipulate your loyalty and conflict avoidance to escape consequences. This secondary trust ensures that their theft only makes you stronger and more independent. You now have the financial resources to pursue justice without compromising your own security. More importantly, you have proof that someone believed in your worth enough to protect your future against family betrayal. Use these resources to build the life you deserve, free from manipulation and fear. Patricia gathered the secondary trust documents and prepared transfer paperwork. Rosa, within 48 hours, you will have direct access to the secondary trust assets. The house will be transferred to your name, giving you the choice to live there or continue generating rental income. The business property will become your asset to manage or sell as you choose. As I signed the paperwork that would activate Isabella's hidden protections, I realized that my grandmother had given me something beyond financial security. She had provided complete independence from the family members who had betrayed my trust. Frank, Sandra, and Jessica had assumed that stealing my primary inheritance would leave me financially vulnerable and emotionally dependent on their approval for family relationships. They had counted on my need for their support to prevent me from pursuing legal action that might damage family harmony. Instead, Isabella's foresight had made me more financially secure than I had ever imagined possible. The theft of my primary inheritance had triggered protections that provided me with greater wealth, complete independence, and the resources necessary to pursue justice without fear of economic retaliation. Walking to my car after signing the final documents, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different life. 3 months ago, I had been a struggling graphic designer living paycheck to paycheck, grateful for any family financial support, and reluctant to rock the boat over money issues. Now, I was the owner of valuable real estate, the beneficiary of substantial investment accounts, and the recipient of an inheritance that would provide complete financial freedom for the rest of my life. My parents had tried to steal my future and had instead triggered protections that secured it beyond anything they could have imagined. The legal documents arrived at my parents' house on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a federal marshal who was required to serve papers personally and witness their receipt. I wasn't present for that moment, but Agent Coleman later described Frank's reaction as immediate panic, followed by desperate attempts to contact family members and attorneys. Within 2 hours of receiving the federal indictment papers, my phone began ringing continuously with calls from Frank, Sandra, and Jessica. I let them all go to voicemail while I sat in my apartment reading copies of the same documents that had just destroyed their confidence in their ability to escape consequences for their crimes. The federal charges were extensive and terrifying conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and organized financial crime enterprise. Each charge carried potential prison sentences that could total 40 to 50 years for Frank and Sandra, 30 to 35 years for Jessica. But the most immediate crisis for my family wasn't the criminal charges. It was the civil asset seizure that had frozen every account, property, and valuable possession connected to the stolen money. Jessica's house had been marked for federal seizure. Her BMW had been impounded. Even her jewelry collection was subject to asset forfeiture as proceeds of criminal activity. I decided to listen to their voicemail messages, curious about how they would attempt to explain or minimize their situation. Frank's voice was strained and desperate. "Rosa, you need to call us immediately. There's been some kind of terrible mistake with these federal papers. We need to work together as a family to straighten this out before it gets out of control. These government people don't understand family situations." Sandra's message was longer and more manipulative. "Rosa, honey, I don't know what kind of legal advice you've been getting, but someone has filled your head with terrible ideas about your family. We love you, sweetheart. We've always loved you. This whole situation is a misunderstanding that we can fix if we work together. Please don't let strangers destroy our family." Jessica's message was the most revealing. "Rosa, you need to stop this immediately. Do you have any idea what you're doing to me? Marcus is talking about divorce because of these criminal charges. I could lose everything I've worked for. I could go to prison because you decided to be vindictive about money. This is insane, Rosa. You're destroying my entire life over money that was meant to help family anyway." I saved all the messages for Agent Coleman, knowing they would serve as evidence of my family's continued refusal to accept responsibility for their crimes. Even while facing federal charges, they were still blaming me for their predicament, rather than acknowledging their systematic theft from elderly victims. Over the following days, the messages became increasingly desperate. Frank called repeatedly, offering various compromise arrangements that demonstrated his complete failure to understand the seriousness of federal criminal charges. "Or, Rosa, what if we pay back some of the money? We could work out a payment plan, maybe sell some things, figure out a way to make this right without involving the government." Sandra's calls shifted between manipulation and threats. "Rosa, if you don't stop this legal nonsense, you're going to be responsible for destroying 3 people's lives. Is money really more important to you than your family? What would your grandmother think about you sending your own parents to prison?" But it was Jessica's messages that revealed the true scope of the crisis the federal charges had created in her carefully constructed life. "Rosa, Marcus filed for divorce yesterday. His bank is conducting an internal investigation because he's married to someone under federal indictment. He could lose his job. The country club canceled our membership. My friends won't return my calls because they're afraid of being associated with federal criminals." Jessica's voice broke as she continued, "I'm 26 years old, Rosa. I could spend the next 30 years in federal prison. I'll lose everything. My house, my car, my marriage, my entire future, and for what? Because you couldn't let family members help each other." The irony of Jessica describing theft as helping each other wasn't lost on me, but I could hear genuine terror in her voice as she realized that her lifestyle of luxury and social status was disintegrating in real time. Agent Coleman kept me informed about my family's increasingly frantic attempts to escape consequences. Frank had contacted multiple attorneys, learning that federal financial crime charges were virtually impossible to defend when the evidence was as comprehensive as what prosecutors had gathered. Your father tried to claim that all the elderly victims had voluntarily given money to help Jessica, Agent Coleman reported. When we played recordings of Jessica's manipulative conversations with victims, his attorney explained why that defense wouldn't work. Sandra had attempted to characterize the theft as family financial management rather than criminal activity. She claimed that managing elderly relatives' money was traditional family responsibility and that the government was criminalizing normal family behavior. Jessica had tried to distance herself from Frank and Sandra's operation by claiming she had been manipulated by her adoptive parents and hadn't understood where the money was coming from. That defense collapsed when we showed her attorney the recordings where Jessica actively participated in deceiving elderly victims. The most desperate development came when Frank and Sandra attempted to flee Colorado, loading their truck with remaining possessions and heading toward Mexico. They were stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint in New Mexico, where agents found $47,000 in cash hidden throughout their vehicle. They were planning to disappear into Mexico and leave you holding responsibility for their criminal operation, Agent Coleman explained. The cash they were carrying represented their final theft from elderly victims' accounts just days before their attempted escape. The failed escape attempt added additional federal charges and eliminated any possibility of bail or plea negotiations. Frank and Sandra were now detained in federal custody, facing the reality that their criminal enterprise had reached its inevitable conclusion. Jessica, meanwhile, faced a different kind of desperation as her social and economic world collapsed around her. Marcus's divorce proceedings included demands that she return any gifts or property purchased with stolen money, leaving her potentially homeless and penniless even before any criminal penalties. I received one final message from Jessica recorded from jail after she had been arrested on federal conspiracy charges. Rosa, I know you probably hate me right now and maybe you have good reason. I want you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. When Mom and Dad first started using your trust fund money, I thought it was just family helping family. I didn't understand that we were stealing from you and all those elderly people. Her voice was small and defeated, completely different from the confident, entitled tone she had used throughout our confrontation about the trust fund theft. I'm going to plead guilty and cooperate with the federal prosecutors. I'm going to tell them everything I know about Mom and Dad's operation and try to help recover money for the victims. I know it won't undo the damage I've caused, and I know it won't fix our relationship, but I want to do the right thing now, even if it's too late. Sitting in my apartment that evening, reading news coverage of my family's arrests and the federal investigation into their criminal enterprise, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the family relationships that had been revealed as fundamentally dishonest and exploitative. Relief that the systematic abuse of elderly victims had been stopped and that justice would finally be served. But most importantly, I felt profound gratitude toward Grandmother Isabella, who had anticipated this exact scenario and built protections that allowed me to survive my family's betrayal with my security and independence intact. The people who had raised me, who had taught me about right and wrong, who should have protected and supported me, had instead chosen to systematically destroy my future for their own benefit. But the woman who had truly loved me had made sure that their betrayal only revealed the strength and resources she had always believed I possessed. 6 weeks into the federal investigation, Agent Coleman contacted me with evidence that elevated my parents' criminal behavior from theft and fraud to something so sinister that it initially seemed impossible to believe. Rosa, I need you to sit down before I tell you what we've discovered. Agent Coleman said during an emergency meeting at his office. Our forensic investigation of your parents' computers and documents has uncovered evidence of attempted insurance fraud that directly targeted you. He opened a file containing printed emails, computer screenshots, and document drafts that made my blood run cold as I read them. Your parents were researching how to forge a death certificate with your name on it. They were planning to report your death in a car accident and collect life insurance benefits to cover up their theft of your trust fund. The words seemed to echo in the sterile federal building conference room as I struggled to process what Agent Coleman was telling me. My own parents had been planning to legally kill me on paper to escape consequences for their financial crimes. This can't be real, I whispered, staring at computer files showing Frank's internet searches for accidental death documentation, Colorado, life insurance claim procedures, and death certificate requirements, DMV. Agent Coleman spread out more evidence across the table. The computer forensics team recovered deleted files from Sandra's laptop, showing draft obituaries with your name contact information for multiple mortuaries and research into grief counseling services to make their mourning appear authentic. He showed me a partially completed obituary that made me nauseous. Rosa Elena Martinez, 28, died tragically in a single-car accident on Interstate 70 west of Denver. Rosa was a beloved daughter who worked as a graphic designer and was known for her generosity and family devotion. She is survived by her loving parents, Frank and Sandra Martinez, and her sister, Jessica Williams. They had written my obituary, I said, my voice barely audible. They were planning to attend my fake funeral. It gets worse, Agent Coleman continued. We found correspondence with multiple insurance companies where Frank was inquiring about claim procedures for sudden family tragedy. He had obtained copies of your life insurance policies and was researching the documentation required to collect death benefits. The investigation had uncovered months of methodical preparation for this elaborate fraud. Sandra had practiced forging my signature hundreds of times, creating samples that could pass casual inspection. Frank had researched the legal requirements for reporting accidental death and had identified remote stretches of highway where a staged car accident might be believable. They were planning to claim you died in a single-car rollover accident in a remote area between Denver and Vail. Frank had driven that route multiple times, taking photographs and noting locations where a car could plausibly leave the road without witnesses. Agent Coleman showed me Frank's detailed notes about tire marks, vehicle damage patterns, and the timing required to make a staged accident look authentic. He had researched similar accidents, studying police reports and insurance investigations to understand what evidence would be required. The most chilling aspect of their plan was how they intended to dispose of my actual existence. Sandra had begun the process of terminating my apartment lease, claiming I was planning to move out of state for a new job. Frank had contacted my employer to discuss my family emergency and potential resignation. They were systematically erasing your life while preparing to claim insurance money for your death. If they had succeeded, you would have faced a nightmare of proving your own existence while they collected hundreds of thousands in fraudulent death benefits. Agent Coleman explained that my life insurance policies, combined with potential wrongful death settlements, could have provided Frank and Sandra with over $600,000, more than enough to cover the stolen trust fund and leave them with significant profit. Your parents weren't just willing to steal your inheritance. They were willing to effectively murder you legally to cover up their crimes and profit from your destruction. The investigation had found evidence that Jessica was fully aware of and actively participating in the fake death plan. Computer records showed her researching appropriate grieving behavior and memorial service procedures. Jessica had been practicing her role as the heartbroken sister. She researched grief counseling, memorial service planning, and appropriate mourning behavior to make her performance convincing. Agent Coleman showed me Jessica's internet searches for how to act grief-stricken funeral, sister memorial speech examples, and grieving family member behavior. She had been preparing to deliver a tearful eulogy at my fake funeral while helping collect insurance money from my fraudulent death. The most disturbing evidence is this. Agent Coleman said producing a handwritten letter from Jessica addressed to no one in particular. She was practicing condolence responses for people who would express sympathy about your death. The letter read, "Thank you for your kind words about Rosa. She was such a wonderful sister who always put family first. I know she would want us to honor her memory by staying strong and supporting each other during this difficult time. Your friendship means everything to our family as we navigate this tragic loss." I stared at Jessica's careful handwriting, realizing she had been rehearsing gratitude for sympathy about my fake death while planning to profit from insurance fraud. The depth of calculation required for such deception revealed a level of moral corruption I hadn't imagined possible from my own family. How close were they to executing this plan, I asked. Based on the timeline in their documents, they were planning to report your death within 2 weeks. Frank had already identified the specific location for the staged accident and had purchased materials to create convincing physical evidence. Agent Coleman showed me receipts for items Frank had bought to stage the fake accident scene emergency flares, automotive tools, and even fake blood to create convincing evidence of trauma. He had studied forensic investigation procedures and was preparing evidence that would satisfy insurance company investigators. The federal investigation revealed that Frank and Sandra's fake death plan was connected to their broader money laundering operation. They needed large amounts of cash quickly to cover evidence of their theft from elderly victims and to fund their planned escape to Mexico. Your death benefits would have provided enough money for them to disappear permanently while leaving investigators to chase a paper trail that ended with your fake death. They were planning to use your fraudulent insurance money to fund new identities and relocation outside U.S. jurisdiction. Agent Coleman explained that this evidence escalated the federal charges against my parents to include attempted insurance fraud, conspiracy to file false death certificates, and preparation for document forgery, each carrying additional prison sentences of 10 to 15 years. Jessica's participation in the fake death planning means she faces additional charges as an accessory to attempted insurance fraud. Her sentencing guidelines just increased significantly. As I left the federal building that afternoon, I realized that my parents' betrayal had reached depths I couldn't have imagined when I first discovered the trust fund theft. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had been prepared to legally erase my existence to avoid accountability for their crimes. The trust fund money that grandmother Isabella had left to secure my future had become in their minds worth less than the insurance money they could collect by reporting my death. My actual life, my relationships, my dreams, my continued existence, all of these were acceptable sacrifices for their financial benefit. But as I drove home through Denver traffic, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The people who had raised me had revealed themselves as fundamentally different from who I had believed them to be. The parents I had loved and respected existed only in my childhood memories, not in the criminals who had planned to stage my death for money. Grandmother Isabella's protections had saved me not just from financial destruction, but from literal erasure at the hands of people who should have valued my life above any amount of money. During the document discovery phase of the federal investigation, Patricia Stone made a discovery that fundamentally changed my understanding of my family history and explained decades of emotional dynamics I had never fully comprehended. "Rosa, I need to discuss something with you that the federal investigators found while reviewing your parents' personal documents," Patricia said during a meeting at her office. "What we discovered explains a great deal about the family favoritism and manipulation you experienced growing up." She opened a file containing birth certificates, adoption records, and legal documents I had never seen before. Rosa Jessica is not your biological sister. She was adopted when you were 12 years old, and the adoption was specifically designed to manipulate your grandmother, Isabella's inheritance planning. The words seemed to hang in the air as I processed information that recontextualized my entire childhood. Jessica was adopted. Not only adopted, but adopted strategically. Frank and Sandra learned about your grandmother's substantial wealth and worried that as Isabella's only grandchild, you would inherit everything. They adopted Jessica specifically to create inheritance, competition, and influence Isabella's estate planning. Patricia showed me adoption paperwork dated to when I was 12, explaining why I remembered Jessica's sudden appearance in our family, but had always been told she was my biological sister who had been living with relatives. Frank and Sandra researched Isabella's financial situation and realized she was much wealthier than they had known. They were concerned that Isabella's attachment to you, particularly after you began caring for her during her early health problems, would result in you receiving the entire inheritance. The adoption records revealed that Frank and Sandra had specifically sought a child who would contrast with my personality and create the family dynamic they wanted. They had requested an attractive, charismatic girl who could charm elderly relatives and compete with me for inheritance consideration. Jessica came from a troubled family situation. Her biological parents had financial problems and substance abuse issues. Frank and Sandra offered to adopt her specifically because they thought her background would make her grateful for family support, while her personality would appeal to Isabella. Patricia showed me correspondence between Frank Sandra and the adoption agency, where they explicitly discussed their intention to influence inheritance outcomes through the adoption. One letter from Sandra was particularly revealing. We are specifically interested in adopting a girl who will integrate well with our extended family and help balance our family dynamics. Our elderly relatives have significant resources, and we want to ensure fair distribution of family wealth among all children. They were planning to steal your inheritance before Jessica even arrived in your family, Patricia explained. The adoption was the first step in a long-term strategy to reduce your inheritance by creating additional heirs. The documents revealed that Frank and Sandra had coached Jessica extensively on how to interact with grandmother Isabella. They had taught her to display specific traits and interests that would appeal to Isabella's values and sensibilities. Jessica was instructed to show interest in Isabella's bakery business, to ask questions about family history, and to express gratitude for family traditions. Frank and Sandra were essentially training her to manipulate an elderly woman's emotions. Patricia showed me letters between Frank and Jessica's biological parents negotiating the adoption terms. The biological parents had been paid a significant amount of money to relinquish parental rights, with additional payments contingent on Jessica successfully integrating into Frank and Sandra's family. Jessica's biological family was paid to give her up, and they continued receiving payments based on Jessica's success in winning Isabella's affection. This wasn't a traditional adoption motivated by desire to help a child. This was a business transaction designed to defraud your grandmother. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Jessica was aware of her adoption and her role in the inheritance manipulation strategy. Computer files found on her laptop included research into inheritance, law, family manipulation techniques, and strategies for gaining elderly relatives' trust and affection. Jessica knew she wasn't your biological sister, and she knew she had been adopted specifically to compete with you for inheritance. Her entire relationship with your family was based on financial manipulation. Patricia showed me Jessica's own notes about grandmother Isabella, analyzing Isabella's preferences, health concerns, and emotional vulnerabilities. Jessica had been systematically studying Isabella like a target, rather than loving her like a granddaughter. One of Jessica's documents includes a detailed plan for gaining Isabella's trust. She wrote, Isabella responds positively when I ask about her business experience and show interest in traditional family roles. She seems to prefer Jessica's domestic interests over Rosa's career ambitions, need to emphasize gratitude and respect for elders while subtly contrasting with Rosa's independence. The revelation explained so many aspects of my childhood that had never made sense. Jessica's immediate integration into the family, her instinctive understanding of what Frank and Sandra wanted to hear, her ability to charm adults while maintaining rivalry with me, all of these behaviors now appeared as learned strategies rather than natural personality traits. Rosa, this discovery also explains why your grandmother Isabella created such elaborate protections for your inheritance. She suspected Jessica's adoption was strategically motivated and wanted to ensure your security regardless of family manipulation. Patricia showed me additional letters from Isabella to her attorneys written years before her death, expressing concerns about Jessica's role in the family. Isabella wrote, I have observed that Jessica's arrival in our family coincided with Frank and Sandra's increased interest in my financial situation. While I care for Jessica, I am concerned that her adoption was motivated by inheritance expectations rather than genuine desire to help a child. Another letter was even more explicit. Jessica is a charming girl, but her behavior toward me seems calculated rather than spontaneous. She asks very specific questions about my business and financial planning that suggest coaching from Frank and Sandra. I worry that Rosa's inheritance is being threatened by manipulative family dynamics designed to benefit Frank and Sandra's financial interests. Isabella had seen through the adoption scheme and had structured her estate planning specifically to protect me from the manipulation she recognized was happening. Your grandmother understood that Frank and Sandra had brought Jessica into the family as a tool for inheritance manipulation. That's why her trust documents were so specific about protecting your interests and why she created such elaborate safeguards against family interference. The adoption revelation also explained Jessica's casual entitlement to my inheritance and her complete lack of guilt about participating in theft. She had been raised from age 13 to believe that competing with me for family resources was her intended role and that manipulating elderly relatives was acceptable family strategy. Jessica wasn't corrupted by Frank and Sandra's criminal behavior. She was recruited and trained specifically to participate in financial manipulation of elderly family members. As I absorbed this information, I realized that the sister I had grown up with, the family relationships I had tried to preserve, and the loyalty I had felt were all based on a fundamental deception that had been maintained for over 15 years. Jessica hadn't become entitled and manipulative. She had been adopted specifically because those traits would serve Frank and Sandra's criminal enterprise. My parents hadn't simply favored one child over another. They had strategically acquired a second child as a tool for stealing from elderly relatives. The family dynamics that had made me feel inadequate and less valued throughout my childhood were the result of calculated manipulation designed to reduce my inheritance and increase Frank and Sandra's access to grandmother Isabella's wealth. Rosa, this discovery provides additional evidence for the federal case against your parents. The adoption fraud adds charges related to conspiracy to defraud elderly persons and long-term financial manipulation schemes. Patricia gathered the adoption documents and prepared them for submission to federal prosecutors. Frank and Sandra didn't just steal your inheritance recently. They've been planning to steal it for over 15 years since the day they adopted Jessica, specifically to manipulate your grandmother's estate planning. As I left Patricia's office that afternoon, I understood that every family memory from my teenage years forward had been contaminated by this fundamental deception. Jessica's presence in our family, the rivalry I had felt, the favoritism I had endured, all of it had been orchestrated as part of a long-term criminal conspiracy. But I also felt a profound sense of validation. The feelings of alienation and unfairness that had marked my adolescence weren't the result of normal family dysfunction or my own sensitivity. They were accurate perceptions of actual manipulation and exploitation that had been designed to disadvantage me for Frank and Sandra's financial benefit. Grandmother Isabella had recognized the truth and had protected me accordingly. Her elaborate safeguards weren't overprotectiveness. They were appropriate responses to a genuine criminal conspiracy that had been targeting me for over half my life. The federal criminal trial began 6 months after my initial discovery of the trust fund theft, transforming from a private family crisis into a public spectacle that exposed Frank and Sandra's criminal enterprise to widespread media attention. The case attracted reporters because of its scope, the vulnerability of the victims, and the shocking revelation that an adoption had been orchestrated specifically to facilitate elder financial abuse. I sat in the federal courthouse in downtown Denver, watching strangers fill the gallery as prosecutor Amanda Rivera prepared to present evidence that would destroy any remaining pretense of my parents' respectability. The media presence was overwhelming. Journalists from local television stations, newspaper reporters, and even representatives from national news outlets covering elder abuse issues. The evidence will show, Wungis, prosecutor Rivera announced in her opening statement, that Frank and Sandra Martinez operated a systematic criminal enterprise for over 15 years, targeting vulnerable elderly victims across multiple states and stealing over $1.8 million through manipulation, fraud, and betrayal of trust. She outlined the scope of their operation with clinical precision, describing how they had identified isolated elderly victims, built relationships based on false friendship, and then systematically drained their victims' life savings. The jury, composed of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 30 to 70, listened with expressions of growing horror as Rivera detailed the calculated nature of the crimes. The defendants didn't simply steal money, they stole dignity, security, and peace of mind from elderly Americans who trusted them. They turned acts of kindness and generosity into weapons of financial destruction. When Rivera described the adoption of Jessica as a tool for inheritance, manipulation, audible gasps came from the gallery. The idea that a child could be acquired specifically to facilitate financial fraud shocked even the experienced court reporters who had covered many criminal cases. Jessica Williams was adopted not out of love or desire to help a child, but as an instrument of financial manipulation designed to increase the defendant's access to elderly relatives' wealth. The evidence will show that this adoption was essentially a business investment in a long-term criminal conspiracy. Frank and Sandra sat at the defendant's table wearing the orange jumpsuits of federal detention. Their appearance dramatically changed from the confident, respectable people who had dismissed my concerns about the trust fund theft. Frank had lost weight and looked years older than his 62 years. Sandra stared at her hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. Jessica sat separately, having agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony would be crucial to establishing the full scope of the criminal enterprise and her parents' manipulation of elderly victims. When I was called to testify, I felt the weight of the entire courtroom's attention as I described discovering the theft of my inheritance and the systematic destruction of my financial security. "Can you describe your relationship with your grandmother, Isabella?" Prosecutor Rivera asked. "She was the most important person in my life during my teenage years. When she became ill, I spent every weekend caring for her, helping with household tasks and providing companionship. She was generous, hardworking, and deeply concerned about my future security." "Did you know about your trust fund throughout your childhood?" Yes, but I never checked the balance or tried to access the money. Grandma Isabella told me it was for my future, and I trusted that it would be there when I needed it. Rivera showed the jury photographs of Isabella's bakery and house, explaining how an immigrant woman had built substantial wealth through decades of hard work and careful saving. Isabella Martinez worked 16-hour days for 40 years, lived modestly, and saved every possible penny so she could provide security for her granddaughter's future. The defendants systematically stole the fruits of her lifetime of sacrifice to fund luxury purchases and lifestyle choices. When Rivera presented evidence of the fake death certificate plan, the courtroom fell completely silent. The jury stared at Frank and Sandra with expressions of disbelief as Rivera described their research into staging my accidental death to collect insurance money. The defendants weren't content to steal Rosa's inheritance. They were prepared to legally erase her existence to cover up their crimes and profit from fraudulent life insurance claims. Frank's defense attorney attempted to characterize the thefts as family financial management and intergenerational wealth transfer, but the evidence of systematic elder abuse across multiple victims made such explanations impossible to maintain. Jessica's testimony provided devastating details about the criminal enterprise's operations. Speaking in a quiet, ashamed voice, she described how Frank and Sandra had coached her to manipulate elderly victims and how she had participated in schemes to gain their trust before financial exploitation. They taught me exactly what to say to make elderly people feel good about giving money to help me. I would tell them about my dreams for marriage and family, express gratitude for their wisdom and experience, and make them feel like they were investing in my future rather than being stolen from. Jessica described visiting elderly victims in their homes, bringing small gifts and showing fake affection, while Frank and Sandra gathered financial information and assessed the victim's vulnerability to manipulation. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but Frank and Sandra had raised me to believe that manipulating elderly relatives was normal family behavior. They taught me that families had obligations to help successful members, and that elderly people should be happy to contribute to younger generation success. When Rivera questioned Jessica about the fake death plan, her voice broke as she admitted her participation. They told me that Rosa was threatening to destroy our family with legal action and that we needed to protect ourselves from her vindictiveness. They made me practice grief responses and memorial planning because they said Rosa's selfishness had forced us to take drastic action. The prosecution presented evidence from 23 elderly victims, some of whom testified about the financial and emotional devastation caused by Frank and Sandra's betrayal. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an elderly woman from their church congregation, described how Sandra had befriended her after her husband's death and gradually convinced her to transfer significant funds to help Jessica's young family. Sandra would visit me weekly, bringing homemade cookies and asking about my family history. She seemed so interested in my life, so caring about my loneliness. When she explained that Jessica needed help starting her marriage properly, I was happy to contribute. I thought I was helping someone I cared about. Mrs. Chen's voice trembled as she described discovering that over $100,000 of her savings had been stolen. I trusted Sandra like a daughter. I would have given her anything she asked for honestly. Instead, she lied to me and stole my security for my final years. The media coverage of the trial was extensive and devastating to my family's remaining reputation. Local television stations ran nightly stories about the Martinez elder abuse ring, showing photographs of victims and describing the systematic nature of their financial crimes. Newspaper headlines captured the public's outrage. Local family-operated 15-year criminal enterprise. Adopted daughter used as tool in elder fraud scheme. Parents planned to fake daughter's death for insurance money. The Denver Post ran a series of investigative articles examining how elder financial abuse operates and what protections exist for vulnerable elderly citizens. My case became an example of how sophisticated criminals can exploit family relationships and community trust to steal from those least able to protect themselves. Social media response was swift and condemnatory. Frank and Sandra's friends and neighbors expressed shock at discovering they had been living near criminals who preyed on elderly people. Church congregations held meetings about financial abuse, prevention, using my family's case as a cautionary tale. The most damaging evidence came when Agent Coleman testified about the scope of the money laundering operation and the systematic nature of the victim targeting. He presented charts showing how Frank and Sandra had researched vulnerable elderly individuals, planned their approaches, and executed sophisticated financial frauds across multiple states. The defendants operated like a criminal enterprise with defined roles, systematic victim identification, and sophisticated money laundering techniques. This wasn't impulsive family financial assistance. This was organized crime targeting the most vulnerable members of our society. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense attempted to present character witnesses and explanations for Frank and Sandra's behavior. However, the evidence of systematic elder abuse and the attempted fake death plan made any character defense essentially impossible. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Frank and Sandra were convicted of conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, attempted insurance fraud, and organized financial crime enterprise. As the guilty verdicts were read, Frank stared straight ahead without emotion, while Sandra began crying quietly. Jessica, who had pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, sat with her head in her hands. The convictions were front-page news in Denver and attracted national attention as an example of sophisticated elder financial abuse. Legal experts used the case to discuss the need for better protections for elderly Americans and stronger penalties for family members who exploit vulnerable relatives. Walking out of the federal courthouse after the verdicts, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. Justice had been served for the elderly victims whose trust had been violated and whose security had been destroyed by my family's criminal enterprise. But I also felt grief for the parents I thought I had known and the family relationships that had been revealed as fundamentally dishonest and exploitative. The people who had raised me were not the people I had believed them to be. 3 weeks after the guilty verdicts, I returned to the federal courthouse for sentencing, knowing that this day would mark the final chapter of my family's criminal enterprise and the beginning of justice for their elderly victims. Judge Michael Harrison presided over the sentencing hearing with the gravity appropriate for crimes that had devastated dozens of vulnerable elderly lives across multiple states. The courtroom was again packed with media representatives, victim advocates, and family members of elderly victims who had traveled to Denver to witness accountability being imposed on the criminals who had destroyed their loved ones' financial security. Before I imposed sentences, Judge Harrison announced, "I want the defendants to understand the full scope of the harm they have caused. These crimes weren't simply financial theft. They were betrayals of fundamental human trust that destroyed the peace and security of elderly Americans during the most vulnerable period of their lives." Prosecutor Amanda Rivera presented victim impact statements from families whose elderly relatives had been systematically robbed by Frank and Sandra's operation. The emotional testimony revealed damage that extended far beyond financial loss to include depression, anxiety, loss of independence, and destruction of faith in family relationships. Mrs. Chen's daughter spoke about her mother's deterioration after discovering the theft. "My mother trusted Sandra like family. After learning she had been stolen from Mom, stopped trusting anyone. She became isolated, fearful, and depressed. She died believing that everyone was trying to take advantage of her." The victim impact statements continued for over an hour, each one describing how Frank and Sandra's crimes had rippled through entire families, destroying not just elderly victims, but their children and grandchildren who watched their loved ones lose security and dignity in their final years. When Judge Harrison invited the defendants to make statements before sentencing, Frank and Sandra's lack of genuine remorse became apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Frank stood first, his voice steady but defensive. "Your Honor, I want to say that our family situation got complicated and maybe we made some mistakes in judgment. We were trying to help our daughter Jessica get started in life, and maybe we didn't handle the financial arrangements perfectly. We never intended to hurt anyone." His statement contained no acknowledgement of the systematic elder abuse, no recognition of his victim's suffering, and no acceptance of responsibility for operating a criminal enterprise. Even facing significant prison time, Frank characterized years of systematic theft as mistakes in judgment and financial arrangement problems. Sandra's statement was even more troubling. "Your Honor, I'm a mother who wanted to help her children succeed in life. Everything we did was motivated by family love and concern for Jessica's future. We're not criminals. We're parents who maybe got too involved in helping our children. I hope the court will consider our good intentions and our lack of any previous criminal history." Judge Harrison's expression darkened as Sandra finished speaking. "Mrs. Martinez, your statement demonstrates exactly why lengthy prison sentences are necessary in this case. You describe systematic elder abuse as family love and characterize organized financial crime as helping your children. You show no understanding of the harm you've caused and no genuine acceptance of responsibility for your criminal behavior. Jessica, who was being sentenced separately due to her cooperation agreement, offered the only acknowledgement of genuine wrongdoing. Your Honor, I want to apologize to all the elderly victims whose trust I helped violate. I was raised to believe that manipulating elderly relatives was acceptable family behavior, but I understand now that I participated in serious crimes that caused real harm to vulnerable people. I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm committed to making amends however possible." Judge Harrison reviewed the extensive evidence and the federal sentencing guidelines before imposing penalties that reflected the severity and scope of the crimes. "As Frank Martinez, you orchestrated a criminal enterprise that operated for over 15 years, targeting vulnerable elderly victims and stealing over $1.8 million through systematic manipulation and fraud. You violated the basic trust that elderly Americans should be able to place in family members and community leaders. Your crimes were sophisticated, premeditated, and devastating to dozens of victims." He paused, looking directly at Frank with obvious disgust. "Most troubling is your complete lack of remorse and your attempt to characterize systematic elder abuse as family financial management. Your attitude demonstrates that you remain a danger to any elderly person who might trust you in the future." Judge Harrison sentenced Frank to 18 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 15 years, plus restitution of $1.3 million to victims and forfeiture of all assets connected to the criminal enterprise. Feast, Sandra Martinez, you actively participated in targeting and manipulating elderly victims, using your perceived trustworthiness as a woman and community member to gain access to vulnerable people. You showed particular cruelty in befriending isolated elderly victims and exploiting their loneliness and generosity for financial gain. Sandra received 16 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 13 years, plus joint responsibility for full victim restitution and asset forfeiture. Jessica Williams, while you were raised to participate in this criminal enterprise from a young age, you made conscious choices as an adult to continue exploiting elderly victims. However, your cooperation with law enforcement and your apparent understanding of the harm you caused warrant consideration. Jessica received 7 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 4 years, plus responsibility for returning all assets purchased with stolen funds and ongoing victim restitution payments. Judge Harrison also ordered comprehensive asset forfeiture that would recover everything purchased with stolen money: Jessica's house, her BMW, her jewelry collection, and even furniture and household items. Frank and Sandra's remaining assets, including their house and retirement accounts, were seized for victim compensation. The court orders immediate asset recovery to begin victim restitution. Every dollar stolen from elderly victims will be returned with interest, and every luxury purchase made with stolen funds will be liquidated for victim compensation. Agent Coleman testified about asset recovery efforts, explaining that federal investigators had traced stolen funds through multiple accounts and business entities to ensure comprehensive restitution for victims. We have identified and frozen $2.1 million in assets connected to this criminal enterprise. After legal fees and investigation costs, victims should recover approximately 95% of their stolen funds plus accumulated interest. The comprehensive asset recovery meant that elderly victims would regain most of their stolen security, while Frank, Sandra, and Jessica would lose everything they had acquired through their criminal activities. As the sentencing hearing concluded, media representatives rushed to report on the substantial prison sentences and complete asset forfeiture that had resulted from the investigation triggered by my grandmother, Isabella's protective safeguards. The Denver Post headline the next day read, "Elder Abuse Ring Receives 18 Years in Federal Prison," with subheadings describing the comprehensive victim restitution and the complete destruction of the criminal enterprise's assets. Walking out of the federal courthouse after witnessing justice being imposed on the people who had systematically stolen my inheritance and destroyed elderly victims' security, I felt a profound sense of closure and vindication. Frank and Sandra would spend their remaining healthy years in federal prison, their comfortable lifestyle replaced by the stark reality of criminal incarceration. Jessica would lose her marriage, her social status, and her freedom, serving as a reminder that participating in criminal enterprises carries serious consequences regardless of family relationships. Most importantly, the elderly victims whose trust had been violated and whose security had been stolen would receive compensation and the satisfaction of seeing their abusers held accountable for their crimes. The family relationships that had once defined my identity were now permanently severed, but they had been replaced by something far more valuable: the knowledge that justice exists, that truth prevails, and that the love of someone like Grandmother Isabella can provide protection even after death. 6 months after the sentencing, I found myself standing in the renovated kitchen of Grandmother Isabella's house, now legally mine, through the secondary trust watching as an unexpected community of chosen family gathered for our weekly dinner. The house had been professionally restored to honor Isabella's memory while accommodating modern needs, and it had become a meeting place for relationships that had grown from the aftermath of the criminal trial. The first surprise visitor had been Martha Williams, an 82-year-old retired elementary school teacher who had lost $47,000 to Frank and Sandra's criminal enterprise. She appeared at my door on a Saturday morning, 2 months after the sentencing, carrying a homemade apple pie and a proposal that would change both our lives. "Rosa, dear," she had said in her gentle voice, "I've been thinking about how that terrible situation brought some good people together. You reminded me during the trial of my own granddaughter, if I had been blessed to have one. I was wondering if you might enjoy having an honorary grandmother to help fill the space that your real family left empty." Martha's visit had led to weekly dinners that gradually expanded as other elderly crime victims reached out, drawn by news coverage of our developing friendship. George Peterson, a 78-year-old widowed Navy veteran who had lost $63,000 to my parents' scheme, began joining our dinners and offering to teach me practical skills he thought a young woman should know. But your grandmother Isabella, would want someone looking out for your practical education, George had explained while teaching me basic home maintenance and financial investing. A person needs to know how to fix a leaking faucet and manage a retirement portfolio. What had started as individual gestures of gratitude from crime victims evolved into a genuine chosen family based on mutual affection and shared values. These elderly survivors of my parents' criminal enterprise had chosen to respond to betrayal by creating authentic relationships founded on trust and generosity rather than manipulation and exploitation. Dorothy Chen, the elderly woman whose church congregation testimony had been so powerful during the trial, became a regular visitor who taught me traditional cooking techniques and shared stories about immigrant experiences in America. Her presence helped fill the cultural connection to my heritage that had been corrupted by Frank and Sandra's criminal behavior. Your grandmother Isabella and I understood each other, Dorothy explained while teaching me to make traditional Spanish rice. We both came from families that worked hard and saved money for future security. We both understood that family means protecting each other, not stealing from each other. The relationships with elderly crime victims led to connections with their adult children and grandchildren, creating an extended network of people who appreciated my role in stopping Frank and Sandra's criminal enterprise. Several families invited me to holiday celebrations, graduations, and family gatherings as an honorary member. But the most significant development was the launch of my financial literacy education business, which grew from conversations with elderly crime victims about preventing future financial abuse. Using Isabella's house as headquarters, I began offering workshops for elderly community members on recognizing manipulation techniques, protecting financial information, and identifying trustworthy versus exploitative family assistance. Financial predators rely on isolation and shame to prevent victims from seeking help. I explained during my first workshop to a group of 20 elderly participants. Education and community connections are the best defenses against manipulation and fraud. The business became successful quickly with referrals from grateful crime victims, endorsements from law enforcement agencies, and support from community organizations focused on elder protection. Within 6 months, I was providing services to over 200 elderly clients and had hired 2 employees to help meet demand. My success attracted attention from Tom, my boyfriend, throughout the family crisis, who had watched me transform from a struggling graphic designer into a confident business owner and community advocate. Our relationship deepened as he witnessed my growth from someone who avoided conflict to someone who fought effectively for justice and protection of vulnerable people. Was Rosa, watching you handle this situation has shown me strength and integrity I didn't know existed. Tom said during a conversation about our future together, "You've turned family betrayal into community service and personal empowerment. I want to build a life with someone who has that kind of character." Our engagement 6 months after the trial represented not just personal happiness, but the creation of a new family foundation based on honesty, mutual support, and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. The financial security provided by Isabella's hidden trust allowed me to focus on meaningful work rather than economic survival. The house provided rental income that supplemented my business profits, while the investment accounts ensured long-term financial independence regardless of business fluctuations. But beyond financial security, Isabella's protections had given me something more valuable: proof that I was worthy of unconditional love and support from someone who truly understood my character and potential. The weekly dinners at Isabella's house became community events that attracted neighbors, friends, and extended family members of the elderly crime victims. What had begun as grief support evolved into celebration of resilience and the creation of authentic relationships among people who had survived betrayal by choosing trust over cynicism. This house represents everything your grandmother believed about family and community, Martha observed during one of our larger gatherings. She wanted you to be surrounded by people who appreciate your worth and support your success, not people who exploit your loyalty for their own benefit. The contrast between my new chosen family and my biological family was stark and enlightening. My elderly honorary grandparents celebrated my business success, encouraged my relationship with Tom, and offered practical support without expecting anything in return. They demonstrated that healthy family relationships involve mutual care and respect rather than manipulation and exploitation. My new community included other young adults who had experienced family betrayal and financial abuse, creating support networks for people recovering from toxic family dynamics. We shared strategies for building healthy relationships, establishing boundaries, and trusting our instincts about people's intentions. Family betrayal teaches you that blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty or love, explained Sarah, a young woman whose siblings had stolen her inheritance to fund drug habits. But it also teaches you to recognize authentic relationships when you find them, and to value people based on their actions rather than their titles. The financial education workshops evolved into a small nonprofit organization focused on preventing elder financial abuse through education, community building, and policy advocacy. The organization attracted volunteers, donors, and professional support from people who had been touched by similar crimes. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Jessica in federal prison expressing genuine remorse and asking for forgiveness. Her letter revealed that imprisonment had forced her to confront the reality of her crimes and their impact on innocent victims. Rosa, I understand now that I was raised to be a criminal and that I chose to continue criminal behavior as an adult. I can't undo the harm I caused to you and to all the elderly victims, but I want you to know that I'm using my prison time to get education and counseling about healthy relationships and ethical behavior. While I appreciated Jessica's apparent growth, I realized that forgiveness didn't require resuming family relationships or exposing myself to future manipulation. The family bonds that had once seemed essential to my identity were revealed as chains that had prevented me from recognizing my actual worth and potential. The chosen family that had developed around Isabella's house represented something fundamentally different: relationships based on mutual respect, authentic affection, and shared values rather than obligation, manipulation, and exploitation. As I looked around the dinner table one evening, seeing Martha's gentle smile, George's protective concern, Dorothy's cultural wisdom, and Tom's loving support, I realized that grandmother Isabella's greatest gift hadn't been financial protection. Her greatest gift had been teaching me to recognize the difference between people who loved me and people who used me, and giving me the security necessary to choose relationships based on that understanding. 1 year after discovering the theft of my trust fund, I stood in the renovated kitchen of Grandmother Isabella's house, now transformed into both my family home and the headquarters of the Isabella Martinez Foundation for Elder Protection. The morning light streamed through windows that had been replaced as part of the restoration, illuminating a space filled with the warmth of authentic community and purposeful work. The foundation had grown beyond my initial financial literacy workshops to become a comprehensive resource for elderly financial protection, operating education programs across Colorado and consulting with law enforcement agencies in other states about preventing systematic elder abuse. We now served over 800 elderly clients annually and had helped identify and stop 12 additional financial abuse schemes in our first year of operation. Martha Williams, my honorary grandmother, sat at the kitchen island reviewing thank you letters from elderly community members who had attended our prevention workshops. At 83, she had become the foundation's volunteer coordinator, organizing educational events with the efficiency of someone who had managed elementary school classrooms for 40 years. Oh, Rosa, dear, listen to this letter, Martha said, adjusting her reading glasses. Mrs. Rodriguez writes that our workshop helped her recognize when her nephew was trying to manipulate her into signing power of attorney documents. She says our education gave her the confidence to refuse and to contact authorities when he became pushy about accessing her bank accounts. Stories like Mrs. Rodriguez's had become regular confirmations that Isabella's legacy was continuing to protect vulnerable people from the kind of systematic exploitation that Frank and Sandra had operated for 15 years. Each prevented crime validated the choice to transform personal betrayal into community service and advocacy. George Peterson arrived for our morning coffee, carrying fresh pastries from the bakery that now occupied Grandmother Isabella's former business location. He had become the foundation's security advisor, teaching elderly workshop participants practical strategies for protecting their financial information and recognizing manipulation techniques. Rosa, I've been thinking about something important, George said, settling into his usual chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose Navy training had taught him to approach serious topics methodically. Your story demonstrates something that every young person needs to understand about family relationships and personal boundaries. He was referring to the speaking engagements I had begun accepting at community colleges, churches, and professional organizations, sharing lessons learned from surviving systematic family financial abuse. These presentations had become opportunities to discuss broader issues about toxic family dynamics, financial independence, and the importance of trusting personal instincts about unfair treatment. Family loyalty doesn't mean accepting abuse, manipulation, or exploitation. I explained during these presentations. Real family love involves protecting each other's welfare, security, and independence, not enabling destructive behavior or maintaining harmful relationships for the sake of appearances. The Foundation's work had attracted attention from legal advocacy organizations, elder protection agencies, and policymakers interested in strengthening laws against financial elder abuse. I had testified before state legislative committees about the need for better reporting systems and stronger penalties for family members who exploit elderly relatives. Elder financial abuse is often committed by the people victims trust most children, grandchildren, caregivers, and friends. I explained to legislators, prevention requires education about manipulation techniques, community support systems for isolated elderly people, and legal protections that prioritize victim welfare over family relationships. The legislative advocacy had led to stronger Colorado laws requiring financial institutions to report suspicious elder account activity and providing legal immunity for professionals who report suspected elder abuse. The laws were named the Isabella Martinez Elder Protection Act, ensuring that my grandmother's legacy would continue protecting vulnerable people for generations. Tom and I had married 6 months earlier in a ceremony held in Isabella's garden, surrounded by our chosen family of Elderly Crime Survivors Foundation volunteers and friends who appreciated our commitment to building relationships based on honesty and mutual support. The contrast to Jessica's elaborate debt-funded wedding couldn't have been greater. Our celebration cost less than $3,000, but was rich with authentic affection and genuine community blessing. Our marriage represents something different from traditional family obligations, Tom said during his wedding vows. We're choosing to build a partnership based on respect, integrity, and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. Our honeymoon had been a working trip to elder justice conferences in Washington, D.C., where we learned about national efforts to combat financial elder abuse and shared strategies developed through our foundation's work. The trip combined personal celebration with professional development, reflecting our integration of advocacy work into our life together. The financial security provided by Isabella's Hidden Trust had allowed us to purchase a house near the foundation headquarters, creating a stable base for both family life and community service. The house featured a home office where I could continue graphic design work for clients who supported the foundation's missions, integrating my creative skills with advocacy work. Dorothy Chen had become our neighbor, selling her larger home and moving to a senior community within walking distance of the foundation. She visited daily, helping with administrative work while providing cultural connections to traditions that Frank and Sandra's criminal behavior had corrupted. Your grandmother, Isabella, would be proud of how you've honored her memory, Dorothy often told me. She wanted you to be strong, independent, and successful. She would love seeing you help other elderly people protect themselves from the kind of criminals your parents became. The foundation had attracted national attention when Agent Coleman spoke at conferences about how grandmother Isabella's protective safeguards had led to the discovery and prosecution of the systematic elder abuse operation. Law enforcement agencies began encouraging elderly estate planning clients to include similar protective measures in their trusts and wills. The Isabella Martinez case demonstrates that sophisticated advanced planning can provide protection even when family members become predatory, Agent Coleman explained during conference presentations. Her safeguards didn't just protect her granddaughter, they exposed and stopped a criminal enterprise that was destroying elderly lives across multiple states. The media attention had led to speaking opportunities at financial planning conferences, legal education seminars, and elder advocacy events. I found myself becoming a recognized voice for young adults who had survived family financial abuse and for elderly people seeking protection from exploitation. When financial predators count on shame, isolation, and family loyalty to silence their victims, I explained during these presentations, speaking up about abuse isn't betraying family. It's protecting yourself and other potential victims from people who have chosen criminal behavior over family responsibility. The most meaningful development had been receiving letters from other young adults who recognized similar patterns of family financial manipulation in their own lives. Many had used our foundation's resources to protect elderly relatives from exploitation or to establish legal safeguards for their own financial security. Your story gave me permission to trust my instincts about my stepfather's financial requests, wrote one young woman whose stepfather had been pressuring her elderly mother to change her will. I helped my mother contact an attorney and discovered he had already stolen over $50,000 from her accounts. As I prepared for another day of foundation work, reviewing workshop schedules and consulting with attorneys about new elder protection legislation, I reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred since discovering the trust fund theft that morning at the bank with David Thompson. The betrayal that had initially seemed like devastating personal destruction had revealed itself as liberation from relationships based on manipulation and exploitation. The family loyalty that had once seemed essential to my identity had been replaced by authentic community connections based on mutual respect and shared values. Most importantly, I had learned that protecting yourself from abuse and seeking justice for wrongdoing doesn't make you vindictive or selfish. It demonstrates the self-respect necessary for healthy relationships and meaningful contribution to community welfare. Grandmother Isabella's love had continued nurturing my growth and independence years after her death through safeguards that ensured I could survive family betrayal with my security and dignity intact. Her greatest gift wasn't money. It was teaching me to recognize my own worth and providing tools to protect that worth from people who would exploit it. The criminal trial and imprisonments had provided legal justice, but the real transformation had come through choosing community service over personal bitterness and authentic relationships over toxic family obligations. Frank and Sandra would spend their remaining healthy years in federal prison, their comfortable lifestyle replaced by the consequences of their criminal choices. Jessica would eventually complete her sentence and face the challenge of rebuilding her life without the stolen luxury that had defined her identity. Their consequences served as reminders that exploiting vulnerable people carries serious costs regardless of family relationships. But my life had become rich with purposeful work, authentic relationships, and the satisfaction of preventing other families from experiencing the kind of systematic exploitation that had once threatened my own security. Standing in the kitchen where Isabella had once planned her careful savings and worried about my future protection, I understood that her love had created exactly what she intended, a foundation strong enough to support not just my own independence and happiness, but community service that would protect other vulnerable people for years to come. The house buzzed with the activity of meaningful work as foundation volunteers prepared for the day's elder protection workshops. Martha organized educational materials while George reviewed security protocols. Dorothy answered phones with offers of support for elderly community members concerned about potential financial exploitation. This was what healthy family looked like: people who supported each other's growth, protected each other's welfare, and worked together to create safety and opportunity for vulnerable community members. As I opened my laptop to review the day's workshop agenda, I smiled thinking about grandmother Isabella's reaction to seeing her small house transformed into a center for community protection and empowerment. She had given me tools to survive family betrayal, and I had used those tools to build something that would help protect other families from similar experiences. The greatest lesson of the entire experience was understanding that real family love means encouraging each other's independence, protecting each other's security, and building relationships based on respect rather than obligation or exploitation. But perhaps the most important discovery was that surviving betrayal by people who should have protected me had revealed strength, wisdom, and capacity for authentic relationships that I might never have discovered in the comfort of unexamined family loyalty. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that forced you to question relationships you thought you could trust? I'd love to hear about your experiences with setting boundaries and protecting yourself from financial manipulation, even when it involves people close to you. How did you find the courage to prioritize your own security when family members tried to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with your own experiences. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming family manipulation and financial abuse, and share this with anyone who might need encouragement to trust their instincts about unfair treatment from family members. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to empowerment. Remember that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish. It's necessary for building authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. I wish you the strength to recognize your own worth and the wisdom to build relationships that honor and protect that worth.